Okay. Um, Hello. I'm Larry Liu, your podcast host. Today I'm joined by Grace Tien. She's a colleague of mine here at Princeton University, also studying uh, for the doctor program in sociology. Prior to that, she was at Wellesley College studying political science and economics. She's got a lot of experience. I mean, working as an intern for U.S. Congress, New Jersey Office of Attorney General, Department of Justice. She taught at Teach for America, she's been an investment consultant and now works as a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University. So, uh, thank you very much, Grace, for joining me here.
Yeah, this is great. I'm so glad we have a chance to do this, Larry. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction. Do you want me to start like
Yeah.
giving?
So I'll just ask you about what made you go through these life choices because it's a very eclectic choice. I mean, also you are from a Taiwanese American family, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
mhm,
your parents immigrated here, and
yeah,
maybe talk a little bit about your family history and what
yeah.
made you make all these important decisions in life.
Sure, of course. Okay. This is really interesting because I'm used to being in the interviewer seat. Like I'm because as an ethnographer, I interview a lot of people. So this is like actually a little bit strange to be interviewed for once, but this will be fun too, I think. So yeah, starting with family history, I think so. My grandparents on my mom and my dad's side are both from different regions of China. On my dad's side, I would say mostly it's from northern China, and then from my mom's side, it's southern China. So then, during the Civil War, between the communists and Chiang Kai-shek's, two respective parties, groups, armies, my grandparents fled to Taiwan. So my parents were born in Taiwan and they grew up there. And then my grandfather on my dad's side, um, for what like they all started out like really really poor in Taiwan. So it was, like my grandparents like on my dad's side were selling like used clothing like on a street stall, and then yeah, so my dad's family like they definitely were not like wealthy by any means. My mom's side was also very very average. But my grandfather on my mom's side likes to tell this story about how because he knew a few phrases of English and he actually like I guess was able to communicate it like relatively well. He somehow got hired like to work for this is like a pretty old um like air like I think it was like it wasn't Boeing, it was it was some other really really old they do engineering for a lot of like airline companies. I'll have to look it up. Again, it's been a while. But because of that, like I think he worked a bit kind of as like a technician, and then even like went to live in Thailand for a bit. And my mother actually grew up in Singapore for part of her childhood, and then came back to Taiwan. And then eventually, my parents made their way to the States. My dad actually my grandfather on my dad's side always had the vision to send all his children to the States, even though like they were really poor. But fortunately my grandmother, for whatever reason, even though she like does not have an education, she probably at most has like a middle school education. She learned to read and everything like on her own, but she had I think a natural interest in investment. So she was able to fortunately actually like she put in some money into like the stock market, I think at a certain point, or just like maybe it was on real estate. But also I think on like there were certain stocks that she like I think looked into eventually later on. And then she was able to, you know, actually do really well like in that. So they did not become wealthy after that by any means, but again, like it was enough to be able to support some of the children going abroad to study. So that included like my five aunts. So my dad had like 5 older sisters, and then he has a twin
Oh,
brother.
okay.
So yeah, so a lot of the sisters like went abroad to study abroad, and as did my father eventually. And then my mother and my dad actually met at Taiwan National University.
Hmm.
And then when they got married, my mother like came over to the States with my dad when he was here for grad school. So interestingly enough, my dad was also supposed to be in a PhD program. So he was studying, actually it was very hot at the time, environmental sciences. So he
Hmm.
actually like did a mixture of like biochemistry and like an environmental science major when he was
Hmm.
at like Taiwan National. And then like at the time he was in this master's that was going to become like a PhD program like for environmental sciences. But then he actually had a classmate at the time who my father tells us, he's like, yeah, she also like this classmate like had kind of like a tough childhood growing up. And then I think my father at the time like felt a certain compassion for this person because he knew that like without a certain like visa status, like this classmate would have to like return to Taiwan. I forget if it was Taiwan or China. Actually, it might have been China. Um, so even though his advisor at the time offered my dad like a spot in the PhD program, basically saying like, hey, study with me and do your PhD with me, my dad actually ended up recommending this other person. And then he himself like was like, I was able to get a green card status. So he pretty much like gave up his spot in the PhD program for the classmate. And then went on to like look for a job. And fortunately, he was able to get a job. I think he eventually switched more or less. Now he's like he did a lot of programming, and he's been working in like IT management actually for quite a while. So he worked at like Roche Pharmaceuticals for a
Hmm.
good part of his career, and then
Hmm.
switched to now it's like IEEE, which is yeah, it's like the for the engineers like academic conference. um yeah, and then my mother was, yeah, she's been like full-time homemaker like for like pretty much like most of my childhood. um yeah, and I think both my parents, I guess I talk a little bit about both my parents because they actually have been like incredible mentors like in my
Hmm.
life. I think they've shaped me in a lot of ways. Um, and I think there's a stereotype sometimes among Asian parents, like, if you read like Amy Chua's like Tiger Mom, kind of like book, like my mother actually was really not that. Like like both my parents like never emphasized to me growing up, like, hey, like you must get like good grades, you must get A's, like kind of
And you
deal.
didn't play any piano, did you?
I actually did play piano
Oh,
though.
you played
That
piano.
that part I did.
Okay.
That part I did. But my mother also at the time said like, "Hey, like I actually don't really mind. Like I don't really like want you to learn piano for the sake of like winning competitions." Because like my parents are like very devout Christians. And I grew up in the church. So like my mother told me, "Hey, like if you can learn piano to like play for the church," she's like, "That's great. Like I hope you can do that." So that's actually what I ended up doing more. Like I think, yeah, the piano for me actually, and I learned flute too eventually, but that was like also just personal like musical interest. Um, yeah, and then my parents, yeah, they actually never really pushed me so much in academics. I think I was the one who sometimes was like, hey, why don't you guys push me more academically? Like I like role reversal with my parents. It's kind of like you guys should have pushed me more, when I was in high school.
I mean, was
But
there peer pressure? I mean, did you felt like, your other Asian friends were, had good grades, and then you're like, okay, I don't want to look bad.
oh, no. I actually was, I mean, I was always really self-motivated. That's the thing. So I actually did do pretty well in school. And I actually even had a very short period of being homeschooled, like from 7th to 9th grade. Yeah. And then when I went back to high school in 10th grade, it was actually a very awkward time to go back to high school, like public high school in 10th grade. Um, yeah, like, I went to a pretty, like the high school I was at was, there's like a lot in New Jersey, like public high schools can be very competitive. Like, some public high schools you attend, if it's in a very, very competitive like township, it's like equivalent to like a private high school. One of those like, I don't know, Andover, right? Or like Deerfield or something. But like my high school was definitely nowhere near that. It was very, very like also, very like, obscure high school. But yeah, I think going back to high school was public high school was good because yeah, I think it gave me the opportunity to do certain things. Like I've always had an interest in like public service, right? And that's reflected, I think, in my career choices. I started an organization in high school called Citizens of the International Community. And I started that organization with with kind of a two-pronged vision. It was for one, I was actually one of a very small handful of like Asian Americans like in my high school. I probably in my graduating high school class of over 600 people, I was just one out of like less than 10 like Asian American kids like in my high school class, like East Asian American kids. And yeah, so
But
definitely.
what does it mean to you? I mean, if you're like a minority and you felt very visible. I mean, was that an impairment to you? Or?
Yeah. I mean, I've shared this story actually with friends before. Like, I think I actually experienced, I think I would say, if we want to call it like a kind of like racial discrimination, like from a pretty early age. Like I actually have a pretty vivid memory of this. This is like from preschool days. And I mean, I just recognized at age 4 that I was different, that I wasn't like the other kids. I didn't look like the other kids. And that I think did make, I think a good part of the childhood, like kind of lonely at times, because I remember like my mother would tell me, she's like, yeah, you'd always say things like, oh, I just like want to find a best friend, And it's not like I had, and I'm not saying like I didn't have like anyone to like play with at all, like in school, but definitely like I don't think I was socially as in like maybe accepted in certain ways as like other kids were perhaps. But yeah, I think that shaped me too, because I think one, it made me very sensitive to people who are on the fringe of society, or of any like social sphere. I think it made me very sensitive to yeah, just kind of the people who tend to be forgotten, by others. So I think actually like even though that experience for me at the time, like when I first experienced that discrimination in preschool, which yeah, it was actually a pretty like hurtful experience for me. Like, and it's something I've talked to like a counselor about before actually. But I think that actually deepened my sense of like compassion, I guess, and just maybe like awareness for other people's like suffering or yeah, like marginalization.
That's
Yeah.
that's good to have that awareness. So
Yeah.
so you were in high school and then you have to
Yeah,
pick
and then from
college,
right,
right?
and then from high school to college, yeah, I think my parents actually never also like said like, hey, you need to go into XYZ profession, you need to become a doctor, like because, or you need to become an engineer or like a, you know, fill in the blank, whatever profession, right? So my parents actually gave me a lot of free reign to decide like what like, and I think they knew from early on, like actually from a very young age, I was always very self-motivated. So like I just kind of knew in a sense my long-term direction from a pretty young age. Like I just always knew somehow that my deepest passion and interest would be like somehow integrated with public service. So I think everything I've done throughout my life really is consistent with that theme. Um, and even entrepreneurship, like now that I'm like kind of in this entrepreneurial field, like I mean, if you go back through like to some of the things you listed, right, in college, like I definitely didn't go for any of like the iBanking consulting jobs. Like I wasn't interested in any of that, although I did have like one friend who's kind of like, oh yeah, you'd be like a natural fit like for those kinds of things, but I was like, yeah, I just have zero interest. So I
You
never
want to have
really
some
like.
public service, public interest kind of
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I think I always just wanted to do something with like a like a public service component. So that's why like early on, I knew I was going to study something like with politics like in there, right? Whether it's like international relations or political science or like or some other variation of that. So eventually it was like political science and economics. Um, and I started from freshman year, like with like a US congressman. My sophomore year, I was doing an internship with New Jersey Attorney General. And there's several bureaus. So I was at a bureau called for like gangs and organized crime. So it was very interesting.
Organized
Um,
crime. So
yeah,
did you bust up the mafia? I mean, or what?
actually, I'm very
What did you do?
proud. There was this one case I think I actually helped develop like a key argument for the lawyer, for the deputy attorney general who was like leading that case. So it was actually really fun. That was for like, I think at the time, like someone who was, I don't know, number one most wanted in New Jersey or something.
Wow.
So yeah, and then my junior summer, I did a less interesting internship in DC at the Justice Department. That was just a lot of paper pushing.
Paper pushing.
So yeah.
I mean, somebody who studied, of course, this subject. I mean, David Graeber, right? He talks about BS jobs, right? Jobs
Hmm.
that should not exist. They're only
Hmm.
perfunctory.
Yeah,
And
unfortunately, a lot of that in DC
yeah, so
and in government in general.
I mean, but I mean, for me, it's an interesting academic theory, but I've never
Yeah,
worked inside of a government bureaucracy. Well, except I was in the military in Austria back then, and
yeah.
there was quite a bit of like, uselessness because I was stationed as a guard, um, at the entrance of the barracks. So when the cars and the people come in and out, I have to check the papers, um,
Mm,
and um, and then I did it for 2 months, and for 2 months um, I was redeployed inside of the barracks for special duties, and what that meant was, picking up the leaves in the fall, right? Because the leaves are coming down from the trees.
yeah.
It was total nonsense job, and then every morning we had to write this report, but it's basically just hitting a bunch of numbers, right? It's like, okay,
Yeah,
today's date is this,
yeah,
and
yeah,
it was
exactly.
it was total nonsense.
Yeah.
And then when the winter time arrived, the snow was coming down. I was like, yeah, so finally we can be snow shoveling instead of raking the leaves. But then it turns out that the military had actually hired professional snow shovelers, so we
Oh,
actually
so you
didn't have
didn't.
anything to do, right?
Oh
That
no.
winter period.
Oh no.
But anyway, I don't know whether you have these kinds of stories, while in government service or.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this. I think as an intern, one, like the kinds of work you get to do is not like super advanced or like perhaps that interesting. But even so, it's like I think when I was working in that department and later like that department I worked for dissolved or was like combined with another department, right? So I think that's what happens a lot in government. I think departments are created and then they're dissolved and like combined, merged with like another department. And it's not very clear, honestly, like what their function is always. And it's like they probably play like a myriad of functions. Um, and this might actually kind of bleed into our conversation later about politics, but like, something I was talking about with my dad just yesterday, like we're talking about like, hey, like when we talk about like taking, redirecting certain funds or some amount of XYZ funds away from the defense budget, like towards like, education or other like social services, right? And this is like kind of similar to the whole like defunding the police movement too, right? It's like
Yeah.
redirecting funds away from the police into like, other areas, right? Um, and it's like at the end of the day, like I think questions that people are asking too are like, oh well, what kind of jobs are these creating? What kind of jobs are they taking away, right? Because the defense industry is huge, right? I doubt, like, of course, people at the top of the defense industry are most concerned for their profits, right? And their, like, you know, the but I don't think they're as concerned. I doubt they're as concerned about people at the bottom, or the bottom, like the bottom half, right, who are just like working for the defense industry. But like those are the people who are going to get affected, right, eventually the most. So sometimes, yeah, I mean, I think these are questions, like these are things that like politicians like Bernie Sanders have, you know, talked about and addressed too. Um, but yeah, when I was working in these different government institutions, agencies, like I think it was a good view, because my original plan, if you probably can guess, you know, was to go to law school actually. You know, I did all these internships, like thinking like, okay, I'm gonna go to law school. And then what's interesting is I ended up writing this thesis in my senior year at Wellesley, and
What was the
that
topic?
actually, the topic was actually on Protestant Christians in house churches in China, but actually not specifically focused on house churches in China. It was looking at how does the intersection of, and this is like very Weberian, right? It's like the intersection of faith and political economy, right? I was curious. I first read Weber in undergrad, and then I was just like really like, um, I don't know. I think just like it was just really thought provoking for me, and I was like, oh, that's crazy! Like that someone actually wrote something like this,
Yeah.
and and then I read other sources, and came across other independent sources, independent of Weber, like on, you know, Winzhou businessmen in China who were very devout Protestant Christians, and they talked about how for them, like they would have a copy of Weber next to their Bibles, like on their shelf. These business owners, CEOs would have this, and I was just like, why? Like, why are they reading Weber, and why? How does this like faith and like
So
political
could you
economy
just
thing?
summarize the Weber thesis, because we might have some non-sociologists
Sure,
listeners.
sure, of course, of course. So like the Protestant ethic and spirit of capitalism is like Max Weber's most prominent, probably the most prominent and controversial like work, right? And he essentially is arguing that much of what is, you know, what is like Western capitalism today, like began with the Protestant ethic. And you know, scholars have debated his interpretation of Calvin's like theology, because Calvin's theology on like predestination, right, is about like, you know, he argues that Christians then had an existential anxiety, like about the state of their own salvation. So due to that existential anxiety, it motivated them to work extra hard, you know. But he also talks about other aspects of the Protestant ethic, like, you know, the desire to bring glory to God, you know, the sense of like vocational calling, like from God, you know, like those are all things that Weber brings together in that in that argument. So it's interesting because I saw some of that reflected in like the Protestant Christians I studied, like in China, these among these business owners, like they reflected a similar, like, yeah, we very much resonate with this, like, you know, our work is our calling, you know, is a vocational calling, and it's a noble calling. And like even in modern day like Protestantism, like if you like talk to different, like, and I've talked to a lot of them because I'm also like, you know, embedded in these circles. Protestant Christians today in the States are also talking about like what they call marketplace ministry. Like there's, and this is like an actual like area of ministry, like marketplace ministry is like considered like, you know, people will say like, oh, you think like going to the Middle East is being a missionary. Well, you can be a missionary if you're like the CEO of a company. You can be a missionary if you're an academic, like in a university. You can be a missionary if you're a doctor, like at a hospital, or you can be a missionary if you are a garbage collector. Like it doesn't matter like what like status or like sector or whatever you're doing or whatever kind of work you're doing. It's like anything you're doing can be for the glory of God, right? That's like kind of the ethos of Christian marketplace ministry. Yeah.
But specifically materialism, right? So it's about, working hard at your calling, and then, earning enough income, investing that into a business, or, into housing, and so on and so forth.
Not necessarily, actually. No, no. You mean like among Protestants, among Christians? Like there's this
Um,
mindset?
well, if we
Or
stick
are you
with the
talking about,
Orthodox Weberian framework, right?
okay, yes, yes, sorry. You're talking about Weber. Yeah. I was
Yeah.
like, we're not talking about modern day Protestants. Okay. I was like just making that distinction. Yes. I think with Weber there was more of that leaning of like, okay, they would take those and like reinvest, right? And to them, like a sign of God's blessing, right, was actually material prosperity. And that's how they interpreted, like, I am doing a good job, my salvation is assured because I am doing like materially well, like at a certain status, right? So that was those were that was Weber's interpretation of German Protestants at the time. Yeah.
And
So yeah, so that was my undergrad work, which then became my PhD, which led me into the PhD program at Princeton. That was eventually, but before that, I taught in inner city Baltimore through Teach for America, as you also mentioned briefly earlier. And again, that's also been very consistent with, like, you know, just my whole interest in public service. So I also taught in the Boston Chinatown, like all 4 years of undergrad. So I was working with like kids like there. So I think that very naturally, I've also worked with autistic kids in the past, like through different like church ministries. So actually, when I applied to Teach for America, I think they you know, they saw a lot of my experience in public, you know, different you know, public service roles, and then also in like teaching, and then they were like, okay, like perfect fit.
yeah, you want to maybe
So
talk us through that experience with Teach for America, teaching in Baltimore, because there might be some, you know, college kids, juniors, seniors who are watching, and you know, they might, because they know that Teach for America is out there, and maybe, you know, they would give it a shot themselves.
yeah,
So, you know,
yeah,
talk a little bit about
sure.
how it was like.
Sure. So yeah, you know, I think with Teach for America, yeah, I remember going into that job thinking, because like I read up a lot on Teach for America actually before I applied, because I knew there was like controversy surrounding Teach for America too, and it's like pedagogy, and it's like, you know, certain like values that are attached to like the organization, and just like certain philosophies they hold. So I went into that like knowing, like, oh, and aware, and I was like, okay, I'm not going here to like try to become some like hero teacher, you know, in one of those like teacher films, whatever. I was like, so I cast aside all romantic notions of that. I was like, you know, I'm like, hey, if I can like go here and if I can somehow like impact some children, or like, you know, I was like, I just hope I am like helping more than hurting, you know, and
Yeah.
that I can actually like help, right? Just to the little that I can, right? In a very limited space, in a very limited context, in a very limited period of time. But I wanted to, I did feel it was important for me to get outside of my comfort zone, because, you know, I grew up in like a suburban farm town, basically. It was like Hillsborough was like, were like cows all around me, like growing
Yeah,
up,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know.
yeah, yeah.
And then I was like, okay, like I think I need to go to different places and experience, like, and just like open my eyes, you know, to different people's
Mhm.
experiences, like, and recognize that, you know, yeah, just and try to learn something also from being there. So I realized too, like, and this is something, yeah, I definitely realized like going into this experience that there was a lot for me to learn. I think sometimes teachers go in thinking like, oh, I'm going to teach these kids, I'm going to transform their lives, and it's going to be like miraculous and amazing. But I think actually on the flip side for me, I felt like that time I spent in Baltimore was most transformative for me actually. And like I would
Mhm.
say, like, if I were to look back on certain like turning points in my life as like very key like growth periods, like we all grow, right, in different ways like throughout the years, but I feel like almost like certain periods, there's like periods of like exponential growth. And I think personally for me, I saw like that period as like an exponential growth period. It was just like it had such a deep impact on me. And I think honestly going into that, like, I remember, and this is drawing a bit because like on my faith background as a Christian, like I remember like actually praying at the time. I was like, you know, I want my eyes to be open. You know, like I was like, God, help me to see as you see, you know, just like this context and what is going on here. Um, and yeah, it was honestly the hardest year of my of my 20s. I mean, I think this is why when I started the PhD program at Princeton, like I remember this one other student like in politics, she actually came to like told me at the time. She asked me, she checked in on me at the time.
Mm.
She was like, hey, like, how are you doing? Like, are you okay? It was like, everyone knows the first year of the PhD program is just like really, really rough, you know? But actually, or maybe for some people it's the second year, but you know, the first couple of years generally are like kind of rough. So, but actually I remember thinking that year, I was like, oh, this is like infinitely better, you know, than when I was going through my experience, like in teaching and just being a first year teacher, like fresh out of college, zero classroom
Practically,
experience.
what is the biggest challenge? I mean, is it that the kids might be not inclined to learn, and they start to argue with each other or with the teacher? I mean, what's the microdynamics in the room?
I think the biggest challenge as as a first year teacher, even if you are a first year teacher in a very well off like school district, the biggest challenge is probably classroom management, I would say. So like classroom management, if classroom management is already tough, like in a decent well off neighborhood, it's like infinitely tougher in like an inner city neighborhood. Um, because like one, like there's just it's both structural, like both like macro and micro level dynamics, right? Like at a more macro level, there's just very, very few resources like that an inner city school has, right? Because they're just not given very many sources to begin with. So
Mhm.
teachers have to like use a lot of their own, you know, I paid for like pretty much everything in my classroom. Like I bought a
Wow.
lot of the stuff in my classroom. But in a good school district, you don't do that. Like a lot of the school gives you a lot of things. Um, and yeah, I definitely I struggled with classroom management. I'm just gonna be straight up. Like I mean I was a I stuck out like a sore thumb in this school. I mean, like my kids actually thought I was white. And like I had to explain to them because they've never seen an Asian person before. So I had to explain to them, they're like, Miss Tien, like you're white, aren't you? And I was like, no, actually I'm not. I was like, my I was like, my ancestors are actually from China originally.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, like Chinese takeout, you know? And then I was like, yeah, yeah, kind of like that. But it was, I mean, yeah, it was hard, of course, for me to explain like race, you know, like to my kids,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I had to like try, right, to like use some kind of analogy, an imperfect one. And yeah, I think
Now, the issue that you're highlighting is that the lack of awareness that these kids might never have. You say they haven't seen an Asian before. They might never have traveled outside of their neighborhood, right?
yeah, of course. I mean, like I don't think I probably was the first Asian that many of them had met. And I think, yeah, I mean, I of course was a very like, you know, I was not a natural like culturally, you know, like there was a gap, right? Like I wasn't able to like I had a colleague who also grew up in Baltimore. Um she was my closest friend, my closest teacher friend at this school. Even though she was black, her mother sent her to a Catholic, like very white, like all girls high school. So she could code switch like really well. You know, like she can sound like a, you know, she told me, she was like, you know, I can sound like a white person when I talk. She's like, I can also sound like a black person, you know, and like code switch immediately. So
There's a guy,
she was able to
Elijah
do that.
Anderson, I think, was a guy who writes about that.
Yeah,
Wrote a
yeah,
black
yeah,
scholar.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yes, yes. Elijah Anderson does write about that,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And so like she was able to do that really effectively, but it, you know, it made a difference because she told me at certain points when we had chats outside the classroom, she was like, you know, when we like got together to hang out or have a meal together, she'd be like, yeah, my kids like see me like as their black mother, you know, and like, you know, I obviously was definitely not like a black mom, you know, like to any of my kids. And my kids, like our school was 99% black. Um, so it was, yeah, my neighborhood. There were some other teachers in Baltimore, like depending on the neighborhood you're in, like some neighborhoods in Baltimore are more like Hispanic, Latino, and then others are like, you know, not, and just like, and this in this neighborhood, it was not Latino. It was, yeah, it was 99% black. So, um, yeah, so I definitely was like, you know, like I was not like a, you know, they could tell like I was not from around there. They're
Yeah.
like, you're
Right. So,
not from,
I mean, I
you're
was
not from
wondering.
here.
I mean, if you're not considered as a mother figuratively, then you were maybe considered as an outsider, as a stranger, as somebody coming from the outside. And is that the implication that you felt like you were not able to reach the children in that manner? I mean,
I think I realized that I had to build relationships with them in a different way. Not to say that I couldn't reach them at all, but that my approach to relationship building with the kids would have to naturally be different, right? Because I cannot embody like a black mom, like to
yeah, yeah,
them physically,
yeah.
biologically. Um, so I think, but I will say this, even though like I struggled a lot in that time, like as a first year teacher, like yeah, it was definitely like I said, it was the toughest year of my 20s. But I think the kids knew at the end of the day that like I really cared about them, and like I really emphasized like building intrinsic motivation, like in their learning and just like in them, because even in teaching theory. So at the time I was also enrolled in like a part-time like master's program in education at Johns Hopkins, because Teach for America offered that option. And like I think the most useful thing I took away from that program actually, was uh, it was just like this theory, this framework on an intrinsic and extrinsic motivation in learning. And like a lot of teaching, like like teachers will use a lot of extrinsic motivators. They'll be like, okay, here's like this prize board, like here's this like color chart, for your behavior, here's like all these, just like to in a sense also to police behavior, right, like inside the classroom, and to manage behavior like inside the classroom. But like, this framework was saying like with intrinsic motivation, it's really hard to build because like you have to like somehow like help the child to like want it for themselves, right? And for me, like I think I was trying to, in a sense, and this actually ties a little bit to Weber, I think I was trying to help my kids like discover what their deepest passions, interests, maybe even calling is, at the end, like in the long term. Because I think when you have that in mind, when you know that, that like shapes every other decision you make in life. So like I saw that in my own life for sure, right? Like I was always motivated by this long-term vision towards like public service. And I'm not saying like I had a specific like, oh, it has to be like XYZ something in public service, but I just knew that like this is my long-term like calling. So I think with the kids, that was really something I was trying to build with them, to say like, yeah, like what are you interested in? What like drives your passions? Like what gets you up? Like what makes you excited? What grieves you? Because like sometimes like the injustices of the world that grieve us most, or the things that excite us most or get us most like riled up, those things are often tied, I would argue, to our long-term calling and like in life. So that was kind of, that was one thing like I was really trying to like talk or just like build with the kids. And they were
Do,
young, but but
would you say
I was
that
like,
there's a strategy to its, building up intrinsic motivation? I mean, or do you think there's no magic recipe? Just
I think honestly, building up intrinsic motivation, a lot of it has to do with like, do you have a long-term vision in mind? Um, Even for some people, having like a midterm vision will still help build that intrinsic motivation. Sometimes it's hard to envision like the long term, right? From like really early on. I don't feel like that's honestly the norm. But even like for some people, it's just like a lot of people can be motivated by midterm kind of goals, right? So like if for the kids, I told them, it's like, if you like have a goal, like you want to go to college, right? Or you want to do XYZ, then it's like you need to do this, right? In order to get from point A to point B, you need to do all these things in between, right? And then that, if that's like something they're truly passionate about or interested in, then naturally, right, they're gonna like feel more motivated to like want to pursue that for themselves. So like one thing I was really encouraged to hear, by the way, like after I left that school, was like I had this one kid in my classroom. He actually like stayed behind a year, so he was like older like than the rest of the kids. He was also bigger too, and
yeah,
I think he was just like naturally built like a football player type.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
I saw him and like he could. like there were times in the past, like he got angry and like I felt like he was about to like bowl me over, you know. I was like, oh, I cannot, like, you know, like if it came down to like I had to like physically restrain someone, like I could not even do that, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But it was, yeah, but he, yeah, at first, like he was also like he was quite challenging like in my classroom. um but after he left and he went on to like the next grade, I heard like he was like doing really well in like all these subjects, like in reading and writing, in math and science, you know. Like I was teaching, like I actually split up, I was teaching reading and social studies. So my kids were second graders. When they came to my classroom, like over 80% of them tested in the red, which meant like they were either not reading at all, like they couldn't read at all, or they were not reading at grade level. But at the end of the year, by the time they left my classroom, the majority of my students were reading like 2 to like 3, 4 levels above our grade. So like some were reading
Wow.
even at like 6th grade levels.
Wow.
So I, you know, it was amazing to me because I honestly thought I had been a failure like throughout the entirety of that year. I just felt like I was just trying to like put out fire after fire in the classroom. It's like, you know, one person's hair gets pulled out, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
another, like another is like food poisoned from lunch, you know, and like pukes on the floor.
Yeah.
You know, like another kid like punches another kid, you know.
Oh wow.
And then of course, you know, I was constantly separating like fist fights in the classroom. Yeah. So it was a lot.
But again, against all
like
odds, you
like
know, you
I,
were
yeah,
able
I've
to get
had,
it
you know,
done. Yeah.
there were kids who were about to like throw desks and chairs at me, you know.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I will definitely take responsibility in saying that, one, I was not a competent classroom manager, but like two, like so like there's a giant learning curve for me there. But like two, it was also like, I think another part of the reason it was so tough is because the veteran teacher who shared these two, I had two classes. I had like an AM class and I had a PM class. And the other teacher, who was a veteran teacher at this school, and she actually like lives in this or near this neighborhood. She knows the neighborhood and all the kids really well. Um, this veteran teacher, her name is Miss Fenwick. Like, she told me, she was like, yeah, she was like, it made me feel comforted when she said it. She was like, look, she was like, she was like in her 50s, I think, at the time when we taught together. She was like, I've been at this school forever. She was like, this is the toughest class I've had in years.
Yeah.
And she's like, and a large part of it, she told me, was because the year before, as first graders, this group of kids that we inherited did not have a teacher for most of the year. So they basically ran like free and wild, like around the school. Like the school was their playground. It was not
Yeah.
actually a classroom, you know? So they were not used to classroom structure by the time they reached my class and Miss Fenwick's class. So we had to like reteach them like how to, you know, just like how to be in a classroom, you know, how
Mhm.
to be a student in a classroom, like that, like all the little like structures, all the little like, you know, procedures, like we had to reteach all of that constantly. And it was, yeah, of course, as a first year teacher, like that was not something I was able to do very effectively from the get-go. So it took me some time to like start getting the hang of it a little bit more. So I would say like by mid-year, it was like a little bit better. By the spring, it was better. But yeah, it was overall, it was still, it was
So I
not
must
like,
assume you would have very strong views about education reform, and to the extent about, you know, the power that teachers actually do have, because I mean, if you grow up in a low income neighborhood, I mean, there's all kinds of issues that are happening. I mean, of course, the main issue
yeah.
is, you know, scarcity, you know, lack of funds that,
Mhm.
you know, depresses uh, you know uh, people's focus on education. um, but to some extent, having good teachers, having effective teachers, and of course caring teachers, um, is an important piece of getting the children on the right track. That seems to be your experience, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this. I think having good teachers is definitely one piece of the puzzle, right? I mean, there's so many pieces, right, that need to be in place. But yes, having a good teacher definitely can have some impact. But I mean, but I have to say, like, there's so many other structural barriers, right, and bottlenecks along the way. Even for some of my most talented students, right, like getting out of that neighborhood is just naturally tough for them. It's not going to be easy for them because they were born into this neighborhood, and there's just like structural bottlenecks along the way that is just much harder for them to like bypass than say a kid who went to Andover, and whose parents could afford Andover, right?
Yeah.
So it's
To go back to the point of code switching, I mean, it's also very
yeah,
important here that, you say that, your colleague was able to do that, and that's why, she would be able to get into the, you could say white institutions, which, we might consider, middle class, right? I mean, like getting into,
mm,
a good high school, getting into a good college, getting into, corporate employer or, universities, etc.
sure,
Um, and
yeah,
if you sort of, weren't taught, the code, it might be very difficult to climb up the ladder, right?
yeah. I mean, I think this colleague of mine is brilliant. Like, and I think she's also naturally just a very talented teacher. And she was super creative, super artsy and craft, like very arts and crafts, like kind of person too. So she was so good at those. I admired her so much. Like when I saw her teach and like do all those things, I was just like, wow. Like some people are just like really like gifted, like in this area. Like I would argue like that's her calling, or
Mm.
one of her callings. It's possible to have more than one. But I was like, yeah, I mean, actually, for real, like a vice principal who like visited my classroom at one point, like when she observed my teaching style, she was like, I feel like I'm back in a college classroom, like being in your classroom. I know. I was like, oh no. But it's true in that, like, I actually treated my kids like college kids. Like, even though they were like 8, I was like, I was trying to get them to like have really high level discussions at times. But I have to say, like, my kids like met me there, and I think this is the thing with teaching and teachers is like when you set high expectations for your children, they will really like try their best to meet you and they'll want to meet you, like when you set high expectations for them. So yeah, I did. I set really high expectations for my kids.
I mean, you just told me the results of it, so it worked out.
Yeah,
So
yeah. Even though I was like separating fist fights constantly, but I was just like, oh my gosh, are they learning anything? And I'm just like, man, I'm such a failure of a teacher. I'm thinking to myself then. Um, yeah,
the
but
important
it
word
was
here is expectations, right? So the fact that if you set the high bar, people are going to want to meet them, and it's
yeah.
like I remember I read this one book by Donald Munro. It was about Confucian ethics, East Asian uh, cultural norms, and the main insight is that in Confucian culture, education is a center stone of it, right? It's this
Mm-hmm.
belief that you know people are not born a certain way, but they can through effort and continuous effort can sort of rise up and you know make a better life out of themselves. And it seems to me that your work Teach for America very much has embodied that. So are you able
Yeah,
to stay in touch with some of these kids? I mean, and know what they're doing?
if they were older, if they were like high school students, I think I would have been better able to stay in touch with some of them. I have been in touch with a lot of the teachers still.
Mhm.
And yeah, I have like friends, teacher colleagues, friends that I'm still like friends with on Facebook and are in touch with. And I hear about the kids like through them too. And yeah, I think if they were older, I would definitely be like in touch with more of these kids. But I think because they were younger, it was
Mhm,
harder for
mhm.
me to be able to stay in touch with them.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I did follow up with the teachers after I left, and I just like wanted to like hear about, hey, how's this kid doing and this kid doing? Like, tell me about them. And and I was really happy to hear about like their progress and what they were doing. So I was really proud of a lot of them.
And so it was always
Yeah.
clear to you that you would be jumping out of that ship after 2 years, right? I mean,
Actually, so here's the thing. I actually didn't get to even stay there the full 2 years, very
mm,
sadly, because my school was going through like a lot of it was just like the school itself also had a lot of problems. I didn't talk about this earlier, but um, we didn't have a great principal, to say the least. We Yeah, the school itself really was actually supposed to shut down like after the first year. So the principal was like just like she had her own clique of teachers that were like in her inner circle. And then there were like teachers that she just kind of like targeted, like from the beginning of the year. And those were teachers that she just like kind of decided like, okay, you're not part of this circle, like, or I remember my earliest one of my earliest interactions with her after I got hired. Um, I was passing by her in the hallway and I was setting up my classroom and I passed by her in the hallway and I said hi. And then um, and she just like glanced at me and then didn't respond and just like looked ahead and kept walking. And I was like, oh, that's awkward. It was like very, very like stony kind of like look. And I was just like, okay, so
so your sense was that you weren't part of the inner circle in that school.
no, I definitely was not. And there were other teachers who also were not very much not part of that inner circle. So yeah, a lot of teachers like suffered in that year. Like a lot of my teacher colleagues, we talked about this on our own. Like it was really rough for them after this principal came to the school. Um, it was like the entire school culture was just like really, really hostile for teachers. It was not supportive of teachers. So I had visited other schools that my other TFA colleagues were at, and I could sense a difference, just in like the culture of the school because there was a different principal, different kind of leadership. But yeah, our principal unfortunately used like I felt like there was very much a culture of fear that was like in our school, and it was actually quite toxic for the teachers. So there were teachers who came from a neighboring school district. So the neighboring district actually in our district like weren't too different in terms of the demographics, like if you want to compare demographics, like uh but like the experiences of the schools already could be very different just because of the leadership. So a teacher I remember who came to our school like visited for like she was going to start teaching at our school and left after 2 weeks. So we had a lot of teacher turnover. And then there were teacher colleagues I had who had been at this school for years. But after this principal moved in, like, one of them started going on depression meds. So it just tells you something about like the kind of culture that was like at this school that was created as a result in part. And I think actually, and this is something I've shared with some other sociologists after I left Baltimore, I think this is also what motivated me in the latter half of my PhD program to study um, management and organizations, because I really believe that management leadership in organizations like plays like an incredible role in shaping like workplace culture. It plays a role in shaping like the kind of vision and values like an organization embodies, you know. And a lot of that has an impact. I can argue like from that perspective, like when Trump became president, right, of the US, like the last 8 years, what kind of vision and values did he reflect to the rest of our country those 8 years, right?
Or 4 years,
Um,
hopefully only 4 years.
oh, right, my bad. 4 years. Wow.
4 years is already
I
bad
don't
enough, but
yeah. I don't know why. I think in my mind it felt like 8 years.
well, that's certainly what she wishes it to be, because he's still doubting the election results. But
Yeah, it felt like 8 years. Oh,
yeah,
that better not be like some self-fulfilling prophecy.
we'll come to that in a moment. So you
Yeah.
make a good segue into your PhD studies,
Yeah.
and
Actually, someone actually asked me, they're like, why didn't you study like schools and education, like in the PhD program? and this is actually Mitch Denier, like, you know, who's the chair of our department at Princeton. I had this conversation with him
Mhm.
like one time, and I told him, I'm like, honestly, like after teaching, like I saw the difference, like in just even in different schools in Baltimore, you know, like, and like they're not great. Like a lot of these neighborhoods are similar demographic neighborhoods, right? But there's still a significant difference in the quality of the school in terms of, like, I'm not saying like the resources they have, but just even like the quality of the workplace like environment, and like teachers feeling at least like marginally somewhat supported, you know, and not feeling like they're constantly like we have a target on their back, you know. That makes an incredible difference, you know. So that was something I observed from my personal experience, ethnographic experience, like, you know, teaching in the inner city. um yeah, and yeah, so after I left Baltimore, like I think I carried a lot of this with me. I definitely, and this informs my research for sure. Like now we can segue into the PhD program. You know, yes, I started out doing a lot of research on religion and culture and the intersection with political economy, and that's definitely still like is like a major part of my research interest. And I'm still working like on a project and papers that are on this topic. So I spent a significant period of time in China doing field work in China, like in major cities in China with like, you know, ethnographic and like interview um, research. And then I also studied, you know, I actually eventually moved into like organization studies, and I was looking at like startups and entrepreneurship. And this is an area that actually was also a very like, you know, kind of an unexpected area. I just didn't, I never thought, because like in undergrad, I always thought of myself as like, okay, I'm doing stuff that is very like non-corporate, you know, it's like not corporate in the least. And then when I started studying startups, it's like I'm suddenly
Everything is corporate.
interacting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interacting with all these corporate types, you know, all of a sudden. And I was just like, okay, interesting. Like this is not what I'm used to. But at the same time, like I have to argue, like I have to also, you know, kind of push this perspective of like startups is still very different from corporate, like corporate and like in the sense of like a multinational company corporate, you know. It's definitely not, a startup is not like Google or Facebook, right? Or it's not, um even if they want to be like Google or Facebook, right? But like when they're just a tiny startup, it's like they're nowhere near that. So the pace, the rhythm of work, like in a startup, the culture of a startup is going to be still like very different, I think, at times from a large, like established company. So
So you talk in your
yeah,
field work about
so,
working at the financial technology startup, and your boss was a big fan of Steve Jobs. He
he
had a
was,
shrine.
yeah,
Could you talk a little bit
right,
about
yeah, yeah,
how
yeah.
that
You
came about?
remember, yeah, you remember my presentations. Um, yeah, so my boss was, I mean, he read very widely. A little bit about my boss, like his background. He grew up in China, and I think he went to college early. Actually, he's one of those like really like genius, smart kids, you know. And he went to Peking University, which is like the top university in China, studied physics there. And then he also decided to he wanted to do he came to the States for a PhD program, and he told me eventually, like he realized, like after he actually tried out a couple PhD programs, he was like, yeah, I think, he's like, honestly, as a first generation immigrant, he's like in the States, he's like, I think I'm gonna have a tough time making it in academia. So he decided to go to Wall Street instead. And he
It's certainly more lucrative financially, that's at the very least.
yeah, yeah. But I think for him, like he actually like at the heart, like I could tell like um he's a natural intellectual type. Like he like reads so widely. Like that's why he and I had so many conversations about, like, you know, books, like philosophers, theologians, theorists. He's read Max Weber now through my influence. And he's read like other social theorists now through my influence. But yeah, so we exchanged a lot of we always had like a lot of really interesting conversations. And yeah, I think in his heart, like I know he like actually wanted to stay in academia, but I think deep down he also knew like he was also at a disadvantage. So he was like, all right, I'm just gonna go to Wall Street and earn a living.
I,
And so
it would
he
have
was,
to be a massive, shock to the system, because I mean, I remember, I mean, I never worked for a corporation, but I did. I applied for a job at a consulting firm. I think it was at PwC,
mm,
and then I went to this, social gathering. You could say pre-interview, and
yeah,
I there's something I absolutely didn't like about it, where it's everybody was asking questions to all the applicants were asking questions to the consultants about how it was like to work there and so forth. But you could sense that there was this fakery, right? There was in it, like
yeah.
in academia, like we don't usually put up with bullshit, right? We only ask questions, if we want to, actually know about your findings and so forth, right?
Or hopefully, Larry, I would argue there's a different kind of performativity in
There's
academia.
performativity as well. Yeah, that's for sure.
There definitely is.
Yeah. So I mean, one thing that I find very weird is, if you spend a lot of time on very long introductions of speakers, and actually I should criticize myself for that because I introduced you, right? Where it's like, do you want to? I mean, if it's like very briefly, that's okay, right? But there's a big performative element of, like, I'm going to read off the 50 accomplishments that this person has, and it's like, do you really have
Oh
to read every
yeah,
single line of that? I
yes,
mean,
right.
just
Well,
follow the presentation.
I mean, if we want to argue, if we want to talk about sociological theory, right, like the reason why people do that, right, whether it's in academia, in the business world, in politics, in online, I don't know, social media now, even,
Even
it's
in my own
part of,
podcast, like,
yeah, even on a podcast, it's, yeah, because people are, this is all signaling, right, for legitimacy, right? This is, I write about this in my dissertation. It's like a second chapter, like on signaling and building legitimate, like brand building as like a form of like building legitimacy, right? For a startup, for early stage startups, especially like in nascent emerging fields. And I was talking about startups, especially in the blockchain field, because blockchain was a very new field. I mean, it's only really it's I think the first significant paper on it was written in like 2012 by this this guy who came up with like the whole Bitcoin system, right? But I think, but the idea and the concept of blockchain, of course, has been around longer, like far longer, prior to like 2012 and 2013, like that whole era. But I think 2017 is when it really it took off globally in terms of like we saw like an exponential like boom in like initial coin offerings like the summer of 2017. That was when I was doing ethnographic field work, and also I was a participant observer. I was also working right as a was like a marketing HR director like for this fintech startup that eventually transitioned into a blockchain firm. And I was able to see them like kind of go through this whole process in an emerging field, like before, during, and after the bubble popped, right? And
mhm.
after the Chinese government like regulated ICOs like in China. So our fintech startup actually ended up raising like about 10 million USD in funds, and then only to have to after the government shut it down, like our leadership, like gave everything back. A lot of other startups did not. They ran off with the money. But yeah, like it was, our startup like ended up giving everything back, and it was tough for the firm at the time because the ICO was actually kind of in a way like their hope towards getting like funding, because like the company was already like on its last legs like before the ICO.
So it was a regulatory environment that changed, that
Yes. Mhm.
disturbed
Right.
the nice situation for the firm, right?
Or yeah, the regulatory environment definitely had an impact like on our firm. That's another chapter I write about in my dissertation, just like the impact of government and regulatory risk like on entrepreneurs and investors like in an authoritarian context like China. And while you might expect that people are much more risk averse and like in a sense like very very careful about taking risks in a context like that, what I actually found was that people are even more like willing to take risks, you know. And the reason is because in China it's an interesting context in that the government actually gives and especially in a new emerging field, the government actually usually gives a period of time where there's like they just kind of allow firms to kind of like run wild, and it's like Wild West, you know, and like people just do a lot of things, and it's like chaotic. But then, you know, they let things like grow on its own for a period of time, and then after a certain period of time has passed, the government then says, okay, now is the time to regulate excess, you know, whatever, and all of that. And then that's what happened with like ICOs, because a lot of scams were happening through ICOs. So and then of course like the Chinese government also wanted to prevent like capital outflow, right? Like I don't think they were happy about like, you know, money going out of the country like through ICOs or through like blockchain firms. So that, you know, the government has like multiple reasons for regulation. But yeah, investors, whether they're venture capitalists, angel investors, or entrepreneurs, they do have to like account for this risk, of course, like when they are deciding whether or not to take entrepreneurial or investment risks. But what's interesting is that a lot of them do take those risks. But it's just that they're also very like, they try at least to be very savvy about the timing of like taking risks. So some are lucky, some aren't. And yeah, it's
Well, and
kind
also
of
it
interesting.
seems to be like in your firm, I mean, you know, you were, I presume, you know, not trying to scam investors. You tried to play by the books, but and also you returned, you know, the ICO money to the
Yeah, we returned all
investors.
the funds. Hmm.
Um, so to me, that's a very weird lesson here. I mean, does it actually mean that if you're trying to play honestly and by the book, that you end up being punished financially for it?
In our case, yes, we were punished financially for it. It's definitely true that there are firms out there who probably, you know, are able to make it for a period of time. Who knows, for maybe even for longer, by making
Right.
that decision to not return the funds. Um, like there was this one, I think, prominent firm that ran off to Hong Kong right before the government like shut everything down. And that's why they ended up surviving and actually doing quite well, in part because they timed leaving China to go to Hong Kong, like just before like the government like shut everything down on September 4th. So it's like they call it 九四, like that's the translation for September 4th in Chinese.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, 九四, you know,
Like
like in
六四 and 九四. Okay, yeah.
right. Yeah, exactly. I know.
Dates.
六四, 九四, I know. Right.
Well,
Can't imagine.
so for our, you know, non-Chinese audience,
Yeah.
it's the same pronunciation as death, right? So it's a very unlikable number, which is
Yeah.
four, and it's
Yeah.
also, you know, unlikable connotation.
Yeah. So that's
I
why
mean,
some buildings don't have the fourth floor in China.
yeah. So four is very bad. Eight is apparently a good
Yeah.
number. You know,
Mm-hmm.
when people
Yep.
get married, I mean, you know, August is a very popular time for that.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. Yeah. Numbers hold symbolic and cultural significance in China. Yeah.
That's
So
really
it
extreme.
is.
It's I mean, it's tangential here, but I mean, the Hong Kong is playing, you know, quite an important role. It seems to be in this context too, right? That you know, investors can
Mm-hmm.
retreat
Yeah.
to Hong Kong, but
Yeah.
then, you know, if you read a lot of the things that's happening there recently, right? So
Yeah.
you know, you have the Guoanfa, which is the national security law that's passed by
Mm-hmm.
Beijing.
Mm-hmm.
You have the opposition lawmakers resigning their post. You have, you know, activists, you know, being imprisoned.
Yeah.
So, you know, what does it mean actually for, I don't know, broader trends in China and certainly for people in Hong Kong, right? That, you know, are they basically, you know, becoming just like any other Chinese city?
Um, yeah, I think people have said this about Hong Kong like in the past year or so. I think, well, before the Hong Kong protests, and this is back in 2017, 2018, um, I think I remember talking with just different people in the blockchain field at the time, and they were saying like, yeah, places like Hong Kong and Singapore were actually seen as kind of like the new, like safer havens, like for these like new firms and innovation and like for them to develop there. Um, just because of like all this like regulatory constraint in China. At the same time, like what's interesting is that like firms have learned to deal with regulatory constraints in China, and some firms are more successful than others. And as we see today, like Beijing actually is ranked number 2 in the world, right, for the highest number of unicorn companies next to Silicon Valley. So that indicates to us that Beijing is a very significant city for as a tech hub, right? As a hub. And Beijing is also very interesting in that it combines qualities of New York City, Washington, D.C., and San Francisco, like the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, all together in one.
It's
Whereas
technology and it's politics and finance all together.
exactly,
Yeah, okay.
all of that is in Beijing. And that makes Beijing a very, very like significant and, you know, honestly, a very powerful city, right? Financially and politically and, you know, operationally and all these other ways. Yeah, so what I've heard from talking to people in China and Asia and Hong Kong, um, it it sounds like right now China has kind of taken on this view of like Hong Kong as like, okay, like we don't really need you anymore. If you're not going to cooperate with us, like, you know, Shenzhen is right next door.
Hmm.
So we'll make Shenzhen like the new Hong Kong or something. And Shenzhen is also a very fast growing developing city, and it's already considered in China like a top tier city. I mean, it's not, you can't compare it yet to like Shanghai or Beijing, right? But it's still like, it's definitely one of those like major up and coming cities like in China. And yeah, so Hong Kong, I think right now, some people actually view it, and this is why like, and this is why I've also heard from a lot of friends who live in Hong Kong, like people want to leave Hong Kong as well, in part because, you know, it's just, there's, you know, politically, economically, there's just like a lot of different constraints right now on Hong Kong. Um, so it's a tough, yeah, it's pretty tough right now. I think as a city, uh, but not to say like it doesn't have any room for development. I think, uh, yeah, I mean, I think Hong Kong is one of those like we will have to continue to watch and observe and see what happens. I don't have any like foregone conclusions yet on like what Hong Kong will be like in another 20, 30 years. Um, but I would imagine like the peak for Hong Kong is probably over. So yeah,
Yeah, well,
um,
I mean, I think they still play some financial role, right?
they do.
I mean, if
Yeah,
you look at money
yeah.
flows inside and outside of China, I would say that
Hmm.
Hong Kong still figures quite prominently because a
Yeah,
major issue is that, you know, in order to get Western capital, right? So, I mean, of course, China has a
hmm,
lot of domestic capital. I mean, you know,
yeah,
they accumulated a lot of that.
right.
But, you know, if they wanted to access foreign capital, I mean, or in some cases, you know, because, you know, under Xi Jinping, there's this anti-corruption drive, right? So,
Hmm,
you know,
hmm.
if you have oligarchs who want to sort of escape the claws of the Communist Party, then, you know, they would, you know, usually use Hong Kong as a way to, you know, transfer the funds out. So I think to that
Hmm.
extent, I mean,
Yeah.
Hong Kong would still play an important role financially, but uh,
Yeah, yeah, you're right. I don't think, I think Hong Kong will probably continue. I wouldn't be surprised if Hong Kong continues to play an important role financially. I actually, to be honest, don't feel like I know enough about the Hong Kong situation to give like the most informed opinion like on Hong Kong right now. But At least from what I do know. Yeah. I would, and I agree with you. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if it's still considered, just because of its legacy and its history, right, as a financial center. It wouldn't be surprising to me if it still does play like a significant financial role. But it's just like, from past conversations I've had, like, it did sound a little bit like China was like threatening Hong Kong in a way, to be like, hey, look, like, we don't actually need you. Like, we can, bankrupt you in a sense, like, and just
Yeah.
make another city. Like, Shanghai is like often compared to Hong Kong, right? So some people will say like, oh, why can't Shanghai be like the new Hong Kong, right? And that's like this like, I think, like, subtle threat, or maybe not so subtle, like, to
Well,
Hong Kong.
I think the issue also has to do with the Chinese currency, right? Because
Mhm.
the RMB is not internationally convertible,
Mhm.
and
Sure.
I think that's on purpose, because the Chinese government doesn't want to give up the control over the currency. They
Yeah.
want to, whatever, use the central banks in ways to
Right.
prop up,
Right.
state-owned enterprises,
Right. Right.
when
Mhm.
to support employment and so
Right.
for social functions.
Right. So you're
And
saying Hong Kong still plays like that crucial, like, kind of like middleman role, right, between like China and the West? Is that your argument?
yeah,
Or
I think
what you're suggesting?
that's what the financial flows seem to be
Hmm. Yeah,
suggesting.
it's true.
Um, I mean, they would do. I mean, not directly related to the current Hong Kong situation, but I was reading this book by Sterling Seagrave. He's a journalist, but the book was titled Lords of the Rim, and so he was basically describing, I mean, how Shenzhen and the cities in Guangdong were able to develop so quickly in the late 1970s and early 80s. And of course, a big part of it is Deng Xiaoping's opening policy,
Hmm.
but also the fact that um, there were like overseas Chinese, who were basically investing the money into the home province, right, into the home
Hmm.
counties.
Yeah.
And a lot of
Yeah.
them come from Guangdong and Fujian, because that's the main area of emigration, right?
Right.
And
Right. Yeah.
it's this idea of like the ties to your jiaxiang, right? To your
Yeah. Your
hometown, right?
hometown. Yeah.
Yeah,
Jiaxiang is
yeah,
hometown.
yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Hmm.
And that, that's that was extremely important, right?
Hmm.
To have these ties to the outside world. And there was another book I was reading, Su Chan. Um, she teaches in one of the California schools. She talked about like agriculture in California, which was where there was a lot of migration from China.
Mm.
Um, and and then if you look at the map, it's like, well, where did these migrants come from? And well, back then in the late Qing dynasty, I guess early 19th century, there was only one port from which you could have come from if you immigrated China,
Mm.
which is the port of Canton, which I guess is Guangzhou.
Yeah.
Um, and that, and then all the people, they come from the surrounding cities and villages, basically, right? So that's a chain migration that occurred.
Yeah, yeah, that whole area of research. I know there's a ton of sociologists who've like done this kind of research too. I'm a little less familiar, unfortunately, with this area of research, but I've read some like recent work too from was it Jennifer Lee, who's like at Columbia right now.
Yes, I think so.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I can talk a little bit further about like just some of the research I've done too. So I mean, I started out my research really focusing more on the entrepreneurial side, and I was like looking at startups and talked to like interviewed a lot of founders and entrepreneurs. I eventually, as I did the field work, realized that like I was missing a perspective from investors. So that's when I like switched more to the investor role, and that's why I have that kind of investment consulting experience. I have that like angel investor experience. So I was actually working as part of a search fund that was kind of in a way like sort of in partnership actually with a much larger company at the time. And we were trying to like just like we were looking at different AI projects. So we actually met with like different entrepreneurs and founders across like different cities in the States. So at that point, I was like kind of between the States and China a lot.
So
like,
what's
flying back and
the
forth.
difference in the worldview here between an investor
Entrepreneurs
and
and
an
investors?
entrepreneur? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Well, to me, they're the bloody capitalists, right? That's the same thing.
yeah, very much so.
Uh,
Yeah,
but I mean, like if you're, I mean, I guess that's like a Marxist theory, you could call it that.
yeah,
But I mean, if you're an empirical researcher, of course, you can't go, you can't make that argument because
yeah,
you actually
yeah.
study empirically, how they look at money and how they look at products and
Yeah,
the market.
I think the reason, and you're absolutely right in that there is very much this like, I mean, yes, there's like very much this bloody capitalism aspect of this whole like tech world, right? Um, on the other hand, like I think when I was working in a startup, and then when I was like working with this like social impact search fund, the search fund had more of a social impact emphasis to it because it was looking at AI projects with like a social impact vision. And that's kind of like a very new area too. It's like a very niche area of investing because most of the times in the past, like the investor perspective is like, where do I find my next unicorn company, right? Whereas like the social impact investor is actually thinking about like, can we invest in companies that, is it possible? Like every investor, actually, it's interesting to look at investment as like angel investors or venture capitalists, like they all have a different vision of how money should be invested. They have a different investing philosophy in some sense, right? Like in the social impact search funds philosophy was like, can we invest in companies that both have a social impact vision and can also be profitable at the same time, right? So I think there are, I know there are like some more well-known like CEOs out there, like Salesforce, like Mark Benioff, right, has also like talked about this. It's arguable, right? Like I don't really have an answer to this yet. This would be a future research question because this is actually one of my developing research projects. And another developing research project I'm working on too is, and this ties back to is very much shaped by my experience teaching in the inner city, is like, what is the impact or what can entrepreneurship, like, sometimes like entrepreneurship has been touted a bit as this like magic bullet, right? By government officials, by like, people who want to like develop cities, right, or areas. And we're like, hey, how is entrepreneurship, like, can this intersect at all with like inner city? Like my interest or my curiosity in investigating this is like, can entrepreneurship intersect in any way, shape, or form with like the inner city, with rural parts of America, right, where there's not this usual access to capital. So I actually was talking to someone at the Aspen Institute who is working in a way like with this. They're working with small business owners, which is we always think of entrepreneurs as like Silicon Valley type entrepreneurs, but no, like entrepreneurs are also just your typical mom and pop like entrepreneurs, right? And like your small business owners. So like the Aspen Institute like has like a project where like they're actually working with like people of color, like in like people of color, like business owners and entrepreneurs, and women entrepreneurs, because these are all like, sectors and areas where typically like they get ignored in Silicon Valley, right? Even the ones who like, and of course, like, they of course come from, right, they're gonna like have like a different like pathway, right, into entrepreneurship. Like your mom and pop store owners aren't going to go to like MBA programs, right? Not like the people who are coming out of like Harvard or Stanford MBA programs or something. But like they still like, they're considered entrepreneurs too, right? So I mean, I'm curious to study this also, just like how can, yeah, like maybe this is again the sociologist, right? That's like kind of more interested in like there's this like social impact aspect, right? And there's also this like can we be like lifting up like entrepreneurs who are typically marginalized, right? And just like don't
Yeah.
have access to capital, right? Or have such easy access to
Right,
capital.
right. So, I mean, there's this language about using capital, money and so forth. And, but it seems to be what you're describing. I mean, it's about social networks, right? It's the social networks that get you the capital. So, as you say, if you're polished,
Right.
you
And
got a
there's,
degree from Harvard and Princeton, and then,
yeah,
you know the right people, you intern for the right people, and
exactly.
then advantage begets advantage, right? It's like the
Right.
Matthew effect, which is what Robert Merton
Exactly.
described.
Exactly.
And
Right.
and then if you're never part of that inside network, yet you have the same aspirations, which is entrepreneurship and making money, it will be just much harder for you to get ahead, right?
Yeah. I mean, like, and so like maybe an entrepreneur in the inner city, and actually I think Andrew Yang ran actually with this very vision in mind, Venture for America. But I know like that whole organization has had like kind of different varying levels of success, honestly. Like it hasn't been like super successful. I have to, I'm just being really honest. And I think he would admit it too. Because it's really challenging. It's like, as you say, it's like like a big advantage begets advantage, right? And there's just like a different like access, right? When you're going to like name brand schools, right? There's inequality. There's a lot of inequality in social networks, right? And this is something when I was teaching my sociology of entrepreneurship class this past spring, like at Princeton, like I was, telling the students in my class, I was like, I'm like, look, you might think that it's just your hard work that like got you here to Princeton, or like, oh, it's just like I am awesome and I'm amazing and I got to
Yeah,
Princeton like by my own abilities. I was like,
yeah,
well, I mean, I hate to break it to you. I was like, but it's not just because like you're smart and you're gifted. I'm like,
yeah,
there's a ton of smart and gifted people in inner city neighborhoods too. They just don't have that kind of access to the resources and advantages and opportunities you had. So I'm like, a lot of that matters. These are like structural constraints that just like it starts from so early on, right? And when you have those structural constraints, like you're just not able to get beyond those easily. And as you say, like when you said advantage begets advantage, well, like, disadvantage also begets disadvantage,
yeah.
right? So it just like it builds up and it snowballs, right? So it's it's hard to, yeah. And that's why I think, and that's where I think people in Teach for America, maybe founders of Teach for America, had this vision of like, hey, like if you can help kids early on, like, maybe get a little bit of an advantage in education, then maybe that will like, take them to a much farther, to other places like in the future. So I would argue, like, I think part of Teach for America's vision isn't entirely wrong. Like, I think they have actually successfully gotten a lot of kids like into good, into universities, who maybe otherwise like possibly would not have had those chances. Um,
Yeah, I mean,
so
Venture for America, I mean, so that you mentioned here. So Andrew Yang was a
all
guy
organ,
who,
yeah,
yeah, he ran for president. But
yeah,
and I remember when he was running, I was watching almost every single campaign rally because, as you can imagine, I've been a basic income supporter for 4 or 5 years now, and
yeah,
I've always found it very great that a leading political candidate would talk about basic income as a solution
yeah. And then you
to the
later
automation.
edited, co-authored
Um,
this book, right, on
yeah,
basic
yeah,
income.
yeah, with Richard Caputo, so I remember so every time in the campaign rallies he would admit to the shortcomings of Venture for America, where he says, 3,000 jobs is what we created, and you compared this to like a couple of drops in in a giant bathtub, where there's a hole underneath or something. Um, so he basically admitted, look, what I was doing was great, right? It won me accolades in the Obama administration, got an entrepreneurship award, um, but he still didn't feel happy because he really believed in, like, we got to solve the problems, right? It's not just you know
Yeah.
giving a hand up to selected individuals, right?
Right. Right.
And then to have the basic income as a solution, I just really like that, that arc of thinking.
Yeah. No, me too. I very much admire and respect a lot of Andrew Yang's vision and platform.
Now,
Yeah,
so
I would.
do you have an opinion about the link between basic income and entrepreneurship? Where so in Yang's argument, it's basically there's a positive connection built in, right? Because you have a lot of people nowadays who say, well, they might be working a corporate job, right? They might be
Mhm.
successful outwardly, but then they say, well, actually, really, I want to be a small business owner, but I'm not gonna, make any money for 1 or 2 years until I break even, right?
Mhm.
And it's
Mhm.
a very high and unsustainable risk. Whereas, if you had a basic income as a floor, um,
It
you know that
would.
you're not going to starve, right, during that period.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I mean, I can say this right now because I mean, I'm technically a co-founder actually for a startup. Um, so I'm working on a startup called Chiron, which is like a eco-tech startup, which produces like uh, eco-friendly, like biodegradable, like they're like home compostable, biodegradable, and also like they have antimicrobial properties, like to these products. So um, yeah, so we're actually like just about to issue our first line of products, which is poly mailers, because a lot of online shopping these days, right? It's just like kind of how people are shopping. So like you get these packages in the mail, like in your poly mailers, right? And a lot of us are like afraid to touch them because it's like, oh no, like COVID, right? But our material is like self-sanitizing. So, but yes, anyway, so Justin, who's the other co-founder on this startup, um, has he has not been getting an income, right, for a while now. And like I mean, he came out of um like finance and banking, so like he did have some like savings, right, and he was able to like sustain himself on that to some extent. We also had a bit of seed funding, like a very small amount of seed funding, so that also helped, right? But it's also been like like some time now, actually, like more than like I would say about 2 years now. So it's like that cannot sustain someone like forever, right? So like I can definitely say, like it's been tough, like for the other two co-founders of our startup who have been like full time on this, because they are in a sense like draining their savings, to do this startup. And like our startup actually was very conscious about not relying too heavily early on VC funding, because as we were talking about, like well, another thing with VCs is that again, a lot of VCs have different ideas of like investment and like what that vision would look like, but a lot of investors definitely like expect significant ownership in the company, like if they are investing early on. So I think the co-founders on this team uh, like decided that they did not want to give away so much ownership like at the beginning. So that's where like bootstrapping. And actually, a lot of entrepreneurs I interviewed also argued that like bootstrapping is like a good way to go for a period of time if you can manage it. But yeah, definitely going
So,
back to this conversation
what
about
is
UBI.
bootstrapping? I mean,
Well, bootstrapping means like you're not relying, good question. You're not relying on VC funding. You're not relying on angel investor funding.
okay.
You're just like, it's like family and friends funding a lot of times. So like going to your aunt, going to your relatives or your friends, and say like if they're willing to like, support your startup. And
Yeah,
like
I
they had like
a friend of
little.
mine, Wenjun Zhang, she's at Stanford now, postdoc, I believe. And she studied nonprofit organizations in China, in Guangzhou and Shanghai.
Uh-huh.
And basically, so what happened a few years ago was that I think it was Alibaba, which is like this big technology company. They started to do fundraisers on behalf of NGOs, right? like labor
Mhm.
NGOs, environmental NGOs, etc.
Mhm.
And it sounded really great. It's like, wow, we can reach out and make raise a lot of money for the organization. And then it
Yeah.
turns out that actually um, the main source of funding became the friends and family of the employees of the NGOs. And then a
Yeah.
lot of the NGOs, social networks happen to be, people from other NGOs. So basically they're trying to, skim
Yeah.
money off of each other. And then,
Of course.
and, and, and then there's a downward spiral right there, right? Because I mean, if you're an
Of
NGO,
course.
you cannot sustain yourself just by, relying on your inner circle, right? I mean,
Yeah.
of course, unless
Yeah.
your uncle is Jeff Bezos, maybe
Right. Right.
maybe
Which
then
none of us are.
that kind of limited network might be enough.
Right. Right. Right.
But
Yeah. We have a very limited immigrant family network.
exactly,
So it was, yeah.
that's going to make it very, very difficult to raise money.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah. So
anyway,
going to your point about UBI, like it would be perfect, honestly, if UBI existed at this point. Like it would be such a great help, like to the other two co-founders who are working on this.
right.
So
Yeah, so the issue is that so people talk about like laziness and like we don't want to subsidize do nothingism, but I mean, how you like is that argument credible to you about subsidizing the do nothing, so to speak?
the subsidizing and do nothing. Um, I think there are studies, right, that are done on this. There have been some studies on UBI. There's been, and I don't know if there's been enough studies, honestly, on UBI to really like justify that argument entirely. Um, I think one study, right, that came out of, was it the Netherlands, right? It did show that um, having UBI definitely had a positive impact on health outcomes in the long run.
It was in
Um,
Finland. Yeah.
yeah, that was a definite. I think the economic outcomes, though, for that study were like a little less clear. And I don't know if
Well,
it's because of the length of time of that study. Like
yeah.
was
So can
it,
I say a few things about the Finland study here? So
yeah. Oh, sorry, it was a
it
Finland
was
study.
2 years, 2017 and 18. The
Mhm.
sample, right, 2,000 individuals
Yeah, you would know this way more. You
were
wrote a book on it.
enrolled
I only know a
in
little
what's
bit.
called Kela. Kela is like the unemployment insurance agency in Finland, and they found, as you said, improved health outcomes. Better mental health, better physical health,
Yeah.
but no statistical difference for job take up. And to
Mm.
me, it's like there's several things that could be said about it. Well, maybe there was
2 year study is hard to tell though.
2 year
It's like only a two
study.
year study.
There wasn't enough
Yeah.
money maybe given. Um, and another thing to consider is simply the selection, right? It's like you select 2,000 individuals who already have no job, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I mean, I mean, if you really wanted to do a real UBI study, you
Yeah.
would basically randomly draw from the population.
Yeah.
You could say, well, 10% of the study recipients are unemployed, and then the remaining 90% is in the workforce,
Mm-hmm.
which is more
Mm-hmm.
reflective of the actual employment in the population. And
Right.
if you find that among those 90% in the labor force currently, like if they were en masse quitting their jobs, I think that would be an indication for UBI not being such a good idea. But
Mm.
I mean, but the Finnish study definitely cannot
Hmm.
establish
Yeah.
that statement. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think, sociologists have done studies on this too, right? It's just like when someone who is already struggling and not having a tough time finding a job, and they have a lot of like health issues on top of that, right? It's like when they suddenly get hit with like $1,000 bill, it's just like an incredible stress to them, right? And having, if you had UBI, like that could like take care of that stress, right, in that moment. And it's just like so much more, right, for someone who's dealing with like a sudden like $500 bill or $1,000 bill. Whereas like someone who's middle income, like dealing with a $500 to $1,000 bill is still not great, right? But it's like at least it's like still somewhat manageable, right? Um, yeah,
If you
I
have the
mean,
savings,
right,
that's what makes the difference. Yeah.
right, right, yeah. Um, so I there was a period of time like I started reading up on UBI like back in 2018, I think. At the beginning, like I think I was a little bit like I'm not so sure because but as I read more into it, I think I do see like a lot of the logic behind it. And I think one, it's like you are providing just like a very stable source of income, right? Especially for people who like need it most. And especially in a world where like jobs are like job creation is just like only gonna get like, it's just gonna continue to decline like with the advent of all these like technological advances, right?
Right.
Um, but some would argue, like some others would argue that, hey, no, like technological advances are also going to create new jobs, right? But we don't know what those kinds of jobs are. Are they going to be high skilled, low skill? Like what kinds of jobs are they, right?
Yeah.
That's hard to say. But at least we can tell like already in certain industries, right? Just like with automation, like, and you study this too, right? Like this is part of your research as well. With automation, it's like, you're cutting away like all these these like blue
Well,
collar, like,
yeah. So I like the hourglass analogy of the labor market, which Alejandro Portes, one of the professors here that I work with
yeah,
mostly,
right,
yeah,
right,
he used that metaphor, and I like that very much. So he basically says that you have jobs at the top, right, which
yeah,
is basically, I mean, everything that you and I talk about, right, being in academia, being in finance, technology,
right.
etc., right?
Of course, these are all like
In
your
large
elite
cities.
jobs, right, so
Yeah,
to
the
speak.
elite jobs, and then we're gonna have a lot of jobs at the bottom, right? So
Mm,
the delivery drivers,
yeah.
for Uber and Lyft and
Mm-hmm.
for Grubhub and Amazon. Though, I mean, there's another paper that we have now with Adam and Janet Vertesi and Adam Goldstein
Mm-hmm.
department,
Mm-hmm.
where we argue that you know even those delivery jobs are temporary, right? It's they're sort of projecting like technology investments, drone delivery, um, self-driving cars and things like that. Uh,
Yeah.
so and then so if you have this hourglass economy, I mean, don't you think that this would be politically destabilizing? um, yeah, I think I sent you a link of a few days ago maybe. It was about the number of counties won by Joe Biden, right, versus Hillary
Oh.
Clinton versus Obama, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and what was really
Yeah.
striking was that Obama in 2008 he won about almost 700 counties. It was like 690 or something, and then Joe Biden was down to more than 400. Uh,
Hmm.
but then but then Joe Biden has more than 10 million voters more than Obama did 12 years ago.
Hmm.
So what's happening? It's basically capitalism on steroids, and it takes the form of
Hmm.
urbanization, right? So people
Hmm.
are moving from the countryside into the cities,
Yes.
and
Yes.
especially young
And I see
people.
that in China too. Very much in China. Like what you're talking about with the hourglass figure, I think that applies to China's labor market to some extent too. Like you're seeing like a sudden boom, like with like, startups actually are creating a lot of like white collar type jobs in China. At the same time, they're also creating, some of them are also creating the bottom half, like the bottom
Yeah,
half of the
the
hourglass, right?
Kwai D, right, which is the
Yeah, a lot of the
delivery.
Kuaidi, all your like the people who are delivering like food deliveries every day, like food delivery is like a huge industry in Asia and in China especially, in the major cities.
And then
And
there's the
yeah,
jobs
all
that they're
the
destroying. is manufacturing and farming, right? I mean,
Right.
it used to be the staple jobs.
Right.
Because people
Right.
always say, well, made in China, everything manufactured in China, and then actually, I attended a talk recently at the China Center. Scott Rosell, I think is his name. It's in Stanford.
Yeah, I saw that. That
Um,
sounded that looks really interesting.
and
I didn't
uh,
get to go,
and
but
so it was a Zoom presentation, and he got up once and he showed us his jeans in camera, and he said,
yeah.
my jeans are no longer made in China. They're made in Bangladesh or something like that. It's
Yeah.
definitely another Asian country.
You're right. Right.
Um, and
Mhm.
that that
Or
that trend is
Vietnam or
exactly
Indonesia.
that
Yeah.
trend is intensifying for sure. So outsourcing is a part of it, but also automation. I mean, there's another paper that I work with Han Zhang Han from
Mm-hmm.
HKUST in Hong Kong,
Yeah.
and so we basically make an argument about robotization, automation going on in the Chinese factories,
Mm-hmm.
and we link that with protest events. Um, but and I remember for the literature review for that paper, I looked at some of the speeches by Xi Jinping and also by Communist Party officials.
Mm-hmm.
中国制造25年, right? So the Chinese manufacturing 2025, and I guess the big idea is that China wants to be the leader in robotics and artificial
Yeah.
intelligence.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure. Yeah.
maybe
That's
some
something
of
I
that,
came
yeah,
right.
yeah. Maybe you can say something
Yeah.
about that.
Oh, no, 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 yeah, yeah. Just like in my, yeah, that's something like very early on in my research. It was just like, it was very clear. Like, I think Xi Jinping had this like goal, right, for by 2025, like he wanted China to be like leading in all these areas, right? Like in AI, cloud computing, like, biotech, uh, blockchain, it's like all these sectors, like they have 5G, like they have this vision for being, number one in all these areas. So it's, yeah, as you were saying just now.
Yeah, I mean, you could say, well, maybe some of that is, propaganda. It's like, it's an image that they want to build up. But underneath it all, I mean, if the stuff that Scott Rosell was talking about is correct, which is basically he described the hourglass labor market in China, and like his main message was that the Communist Party would have to invest in education, training, and basically it's about contriving more positions in the middle of society,
Mm-hmm.
a big
Mm-hmm.
middle class is important to political stability, right?
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
an old argument by Aristotle, right? And he was right
Right.
about that, actually. I mean, because everywhere where you see the middle shrinking, right, and then the extremes are increasing. I
Yeah.
mean, it's like the political situation is very unstable. I mean, Arab
Yeah.
Spring, right?
Right.
I remember I was in there was back in my time in Oxford, and I attended a talk on you could say the social determinants of Arab Spring, the
Mm.
protest that toppled the Egyptian government in
Yeah.
2011.
Yeah.
And it turns out that if you look at the protest leaders who were put in jail by the regime in the early
Mm-hmm.
days
Mm-hmm.
of the protest, they were engineering graduates. So I guess at the
Mm.
bachelor and also the doctorate level.
Right. Yeah.
So, which you think to yourself, well, that's weird. I mean, like if you study STEM, right? So we're not talking about
Yeah.
literature and art history, right? So the liberal arts that supposedly nobody needs, right? Which is not true anyway. I love liberal arts, but it but
We're in
it,
the liberal arts ourselves.
we are liberal artists. So we're the sociologists who is only there to critique the system rather than to I guess build the systems. It's a critique against us. But anyway, but it was important to state that, like, a lot of the protesters, right, they were highly educated. What's very interesting is that it's like farmers are usually never going to protest unless they're starving, right?
Yeah.
Like, if it's like, like a lot of the peasant rebellions, if you read throughout Chinese history, I mean,
Right.
every
Right.
dynasty collapsed after the peasant rebellion, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
because
Mm-hmm.
a peasant doesn't require much to live on, actually, because
Yeah.
he does
Yeah.
he doesn't know much, so why should he ask for much? But for the highly educated people, right, where
Mm-hmm.
basically the government tells you, if you're a young person, go to college and you'll get a good job, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
every single graduate, aspiring graduate, is sort of told that story, right? It's
Right.
like, go to college, you'll get a good job, and
And then
then
there aren't enough jobs for those college
that's exactly
graduates.
right, and
Yeah.
that's a big part of it. I mean, so of course, rising food prices was a big issue in
Yeah.
Arab Spring too, but
Our colleague Vivek, right, is working on that, like in the context of
of
India,
India, yeah,
right? Yeah.
yeah, he talks about the job training programs that the government in India
Mm-hmm.
sort of comes up with, and
Yeah.
so like I just had a brief conversation with him on this, and it seems to be like he suggests that that a lot of it is propaganda from the government, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
it's about selling a vision of there's a
Yeah.
future for you, but
Right.
like what are you
Right.
actually doing, right? Uh,
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is why, I mean, this is transitioning now into this like conversation on politics, right? This is why I think this is actually going also, this segues nicely with the UBI conversation. I mean, actually, Bernie Sanders and Andrew Yang have opposing visions a little bit. Not like, actually, I think in some sense they're very sympathetic to each other, and I think they're actually in agreement in a lot of ways. But I think the ways that they implement that vision is different, right? Because Bernie Sanders is supporting like providing like jobs, right? Like having like a job guarantee in a sense, right? Rather than an income guarantee, which is what Andrew Yang is like pushing for, right?
did you have a
Um,
preference? I mean, on that?
for the two, I think the American spirit naturally is this very like agentic driven, like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Kind of like mentality. Um, And I mean, like MLK, like it gave this, I don't know, there's some like interview I saw of him like from some time ago that was posted by, I think by his daughter, like on Twitter. It was, and it was an interview of him saying like, yeah, we tell the black man to pull himself up by his bootstraps, but the thing is like he doesn't have like he can't like it's just like you're telling like he doesn't even have shoes to begin with,
No shoots. Yeah.
and you're asking him to pull himself up by his bootstraps, right? So I think with the jobs guarantee, it's like if there's a way to actually guarantee that every single person will be able to have a job, like that could be, I don't know, that could be a possible solution too. But I mean, I wonder like, what kind of jobs are going to be guaranteed, right? Like, and what kind of jobs are going to be created. And that, I don't know, it seems actually in a way harder to implement than like a UBI solution. Like UBI seems like even more direct, right, in some ways.
Right, because the
But
government has a
maybe,
lot of experience cutting checks, right? Like Social Security, as
right.
well as tech, things like that.
Yeah, yeah, sure, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, even right now, right, our Congress is having this debate over like extending stimulus, right? And just like, and that's going to impact a lot of people, right? Like right now in this pandemic. So that's going to be, I mean, hopefully, I think I'm guessing like something eventually will be passed. It's just going to take some time because it's Congress. Um,
Yeah, I mean, but I think the politics of language here, I mean, we should pay close attention here because I'm sure, like,
yeah,
if you do like a survey among the American public
yeah,
and you use the word stimulus, I mean, I think there's a lot of positive feelings for it.
Yes.
Social Security, very positive. Medicare, very
Yes.
positive.
Yes.
And you know, like, but then you might have programs like food stamps where it's like, because you have to be low income to get it, right? So then you create a stigma around the term, right? Like,
Right.
oh no, I'm not one
Yeah.
of those bloody people, right?
Right. Right.
Um,
For sure. For sure.
and
Yeah.
so, and then with basic income also, like, you know, you remember when Yang was running and he said, you know, freedom dividend, right? He called it freedom dividend instead of basic
Yeah.
income.
Freedom dividend instead of,
Um,
yeah, freedom
because
dividend.
people like the word freedom, you know, and it,
Yeah. Actually, I was hoping we could talk a little bit about the politics of language, because I think that's something that is a really this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. Politics of language in relation to policy making. And I mean, this is a debate, right, that's come up more recently again with Obama's recent interview, right? I think it was like some Snapchat actually interview he gave, right? And he talked about like defund the police, right, as like poor slogan, like as a poor slogan and a poor way of framing,
Mhm.
right? Like, and he's like, you're actually like losing support by framing this issue in this way. Um, but then the activist like view, right, like from AOC, from Ilhan Omar, and like from other progressive like, you know, leadership or just like activists, is that like, hey, we've tried like polite language, right, and you know, didn't get us anywhere. So like defund the police has actually captured the public imagination, and it's now like part of the conversation because it's it's discomforting, it's uncomfortable, right? So they're arguing like you do have to make people uncomfortable, like at a certain point
Well,
to even
slogans are
like,
galvanizing. I mean, I think they're
yes,
right about that. So.
right, right, right. Yeah. So I mean, I think I had this exchange with one activist on Twitter like a little while ago, and she actually wrote a really big piece for, I think it was Vanity Fair, on like abolishing the police. And I responded to her and I was saying like, hey, this is like super well researched. It was a beautifully written piece. Um, and I mean, of course, you know, she went to Harvard Law School, right? Like all of that. So it's like, you know, she has all the creds and everything too.
Mhm.
Um, but I critiqued her piece because I was like, look, like, you know, like I think when you use the phrase like abolish the police, I'm like, you're not actually, like, you're just providing ammunition. And this is like pre-November elections. I was saying this to her. I'm like, you're just providing ammunition to the Trump campaign, you know, to like the Trump camp. To like, and it's not actually like furthering or helping the cause that you want to help, like possibly at the end of the day. So I was, you know, I was saying like, hey, like MLK understood that yes, there's a time for discomfort, but there's also a time for diplomacy, right? So I think in a way I get the sense that's a little bit of what Obama is arguing too. But actually, I think one journalist who interpreted Obama's statements like was more cynical and said like, oh, well, I don't think Obama even wants to defund the police. I don't think he even wants, like, he should just be honest and say like he doesn't want to. I think it's from some like New York Magazine writer. Um, and I actually don't know if I agree with that interpretation. Like my interpretation of Obama's statements is that like he also does want to, like, I think everyone can agree that if we're talking about defunding the police in terms of like redirecting police funds or redirecting funds, just more funds in general to like social services, welfare services, or just like community services for a neighborhood, I think most people can get behind that. I don't think anyone's like against that, right? Um, I mean, my takeaway from that conversation was that Obama was kind of saying like, look, like if you want to get people behind a cause, like sometimes you have to frame it in a certain way that they can understand, that is like that they can digest. And I think this is where like a politician, like someone that I also really admire is like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, and like, you know, a lot of people across the political spectrum, whether like progressive or like, you know, establishment Democrat, centrist, you know, whatever. Like I think a lot of them have given her a ton of credit because like she is one of those rare politicians that is, at least right now, who is able to, like, she's used to dealing with a conservative electorate in Georgia, but she's considered a progressive down there. Like she gave this big speech to like the Roosevelt like progressive, like some like action network. I forget the name, but it was like some Roosevelt like youth progressive like activist group. And she was saying to them, like, you know, I believe like progressivism is like progress from where we are, you know, and she knows, like, she's like, you know, there's this like other feature article I read about her that talked about like she's used to like courting conservative centrist voters her entire life, but she also knows how to like speak to voters like who are like, you know, your young Black, brown, Asian, people of color voters, right, and who are not maybe like the most conservative or centrist voters, and she knows how to mobilize those voters too, right? And as we see in like, you know, as we saw in the November election, like presidential election, and we see like right now in the runoffs, like she's doing an incredible job like mobilizing like centrist and conservative voters, right? So like I kind of see her as like as a, kind of in a modern day MLK, in that like she's able to, she knows like she understands like discomfort. I think she also understands that discomfort at times is going to be part of the process, right? And I in this way I very much agree with like AOC and others and activists that like, yeah, you can't just be like, hey, you can't say like, oh, just for white people's comfort, like we're not going to talk about uncomfortable things. Like, I mean, civil rights would have never happened, right, if you didn't talk about uncomfortable things, right, or didn't make white people uncomfortable at the time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think like police reform is going to happen either if we don't like do make some people uncomfortable at first, right? But at the same time, like I also agree very much with like Stacey Abrams that like someone like, you know, who's used to talking to centrist voters or conservative voters in Georgia, like, yeah, we need to like be able to interpret and like talk about issues in a way to those voters that in language that they can understand, right? In language that they're like, oh, right, just like you're not attaching a stigma. Because like when we say defund or abolish, like people who don't understand, who don't have, you know, law degrees from Harvard, who aren't like very well educated elite activists,
Mhm.
because even activists, honestly, a lot of them are very intellectually elite circles. Like they
Exactly.
understand these
Yeah. Yeah.
terminologies, they can understand these things. But you're talking to like voters who like don't study these things. They're not
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
activist circles. Like they're not used to speaking this language. Like how can we expect them to understand what defund or abolish actually means? Like they're just
Mhm.
gonna, a lot of them just interpret it as like, oh, you want to get rid of police departments overnight, you know, like I actually had to have like several conversations with different activists like at the beginning, when this conversation was still just at the very beginning stages, and I was like trying to understand, I'm like, what does defund mean, what does abolish mean, right? But you know, I'm a researcher, right? So I'm gonna go and read up like all these articles, right? It took me time to like get acquainted with the language and understand like what it meant too. And even now it's still an evolving term, right? So like some activists and some people might have different interpretations of what defund means, what abolish means, right? And some actually would argue that they do eventually imagine a future without police, right? And that is the vision of some activists. But those, I think that's where like, you know, some other politicians, and I think including Bernie Sanders, if you look up Bernie Sanders' position on defund the police, like he does not, he's like I don't, he like articulated in some
He
interviews,
talks
he's
about
like,
community policing. That's what he wants.
right,
Like, you know.
right, he wants community policing, right? And actually I don't think AOC is talking about, I at least from what I understand of what I've read from AOC, like I don't think she is also talking about like, oh yeah, let's get rid of community policing. Like I think she's saying like, yeah, let's take police away from the streets, at least something she said in an interview, let's take police away from the streets and put them back in schools, right? And she wants to have like certain police like in different schools instead. That was like one thing she had suggested at a certain point.
Well,
But
but then you have the Trump and the Trumpists who then say, well, it's all about, taking diversity classes and saying the politically correct thing rather than actually serving the broader public. And so you're definitely right. I mean, there are cultural conflict issues. Also, there's a trade-off between power versus principles, right? And so I sent you last week, I think, my blog that I wrote about British politics, right? Like Brown versus
oh, I
Blair.
have to go look that. I haven't had a chance
Those
to read
are
it yet.
two Labour Party leaders, and
Yeah.
I guess the conflict was about whether to embrace neoliberalism and thereby capture you could say, the center of the British electorate,
Oh, we
which
talked,
is
did we talk about this at lunch that
which is
time?
we might have done so, but
I think we
our
did talk about
listeners
it.
out there
Okay.
haven't
Yeah,
were
exactly. No,
interested.
no, this is
That's why
super
we should bring
interesting.
this up
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I agree. I
Where
agree.
basically,
This is great.
so Tony Blair won the election 3 times in a
Yeah,
row with the Labour
yeah,
Party
right.
by basically doing Thatcher light. So Thatcher was another leader, the predecessor in the
Mhm.
1980s,
Yeah, yeah, of course.
who began the new liberal reforms. And the successor in his cabinet, his name is Gordon Brown,
Mm-hmm.
and he only agreed with neoliberalism only up to a point, right? Because his main idea is, we're going to reduce childhood poverty, we're going to give more tax credits to working class families. So he was like a
Mm-hmm.
classic labor politician, right?
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
lost the election in the middle of the Great Recession. It was in 2010.
Mm.
um, and and then you start seeing where the trade-off is, right? It's like, power versus principles, and left-wing principles, right? But then you can only win in liberal districts, like AOC or Ilan Omar,
Right.
um, or you're gonna do, you know, you could say, the dirty compromises. You get a bigger share of the electorate. You get a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the moderates, the centrists, and then the progressives will kind of, they'll still vote for you because the other side is much worse, right?
Mm.
Um, so, and then it's, much easier for you to win it. So the counterfactual that we don't have in American politics is, what if Bernie Sanders won the Democratic nomination? We don't have that counterfactual. I think it's bad because we cannot really test out whether actually um, you know whether people are scared of political principles, right?
I
Um,
mean, I will say this, like having followed the election pretty closely this year, I think the media portrayal of Bernie Sanders oftentimes was that he was way more socialist and way more radical than a lot of his counterparts, like in the Democratic primaries. And just reading mainstream like news media articles of him. This is not like Fox News, like I'm reading like the Atlantic, right? I'm reading New York Times. I'm reading like other like Vox, right? Like a whole slew of like Washington Post, right? Whatever. Like even I think some of those portrayals of Bernie Sanders like felt just like the perception of him I got felt like, oh, he is definitely more far left compared to other people like in the field. Whereas like actually when you compare him side by side with Andrew Yang, I don't think they're actually like that different from each other. But perhaps the way that some of the issues are framed or the way that they are also framed by the media and portrayed in the media is very different. So like, I mean, my honest opinion was that like if Bernie Sanders had run like in the election in the general like as a presidential candidate, unless he suddenly changed his language and his framing and the media portrayed him differently, like it's very very predictable that the Republicans would have called him a socialist. He's like in some sense like he was associated with like democratic socialism, right? Like he actually at certain points used, I think he and other progressives used that label, democratic socialism, right? So you can, and I mean, there are Democrats, right, who've argued that part of the down ballot losses were caused in part by Republican framing, right? Of like, oh, like disorder and chaos, right, from defund the police, or um, or just like socialists. And like, I know when I talk to, and of course, like activists and progressives and others would also argue, like, hey, it's not just that, it's not just framing. Like, there's also a lot of issues with like the way they ran their campaigns, or whatever. Or there's a lot of different arguments out there too. So we can, I'm not saying any one of those is necessarily like better or more right. I'm just like, yeah, kind of like just quickly summarizing those arguments. But I think at least like with suddenly lost my train of thought. Goodness. At least with like Bernie Sanders though, I think or versus like a Joe Biden, right? Like the I think the immediate like sense or interpretation, right, or portrayal of them in the media was definitely like Biden was the centrist like from the start, right? And Bernie Sanders was definitely like not centrist, So the party perhaps will continue to move farther left. So in the future, someone like Bernie Sanders, maybe AOC or someone else, right, like could run like in that environment potentially. Um, I guess we'll have to see.
Well, I
Like
mean,
that's
there's definitely a generational shift. I think in the last lunch conversation, we spoke about the Economist article, which depicted generational shifts in political views, right? And
yeah,
basically, the
yeah,
argument is that society is becoming more liberal and progressive on,
on the
certain
whole,
issues. Yeah, so especially on the social
on
issues. I
certain,
mean, like,
right.
acceptance of gay marriage and abortion, but
Mm-hmm,
also
mm-hmm,
to some extent on economic policy, like using the government to redistribute to the poor and so forth.
mm-hmm,
Uh,
mm-hmm,
and what's very important to note is that it's not individuals who are changing their minds. Rather, it is that
mm-hmm,
old people die and young people come up and become the majority, basically,
mm-hmm,
over
mm-hmm.
time. And
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
if you look, for instance, at polls about socialism labeling, right?
yeah.
I think socialism itself has become less negative, especially among the younger generations.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, Millennials born after 1980 essentially are
Right.
less receptive to it, and it's very simple why. I mean, I spoke with an older guy who was born in the 1950s, maybe, and he said
Mm-hmm.
when he was a kid, they would be hiding in the bunker because there was a, a atomic bomb drills
Yeah. Right.
back in the days, and then they would say, these red Russians, these Bolsheviks
Mm-hmm.
are gonna come
Yeah.
destroy your neighborhood,
Exactly.
and,
Right.
and I think that red scare. I think it influences people's views, right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think this is something we mentioned too in the last conversation we had over lunch. But I mean, I was looking a lot. I was looking pretty closely at what progressives were going to say after the November 4 results, and I was like very curious to see like how they would respond to a lot of the losses in like the House. And I think even AOC like admitted early on, like in a Twitter post, she was like, yeah, like I think like progressives like have work to do in terms of understanding like conservative Latino communities. Like she admitted that, which I thought was very like, that was, yeah, I'm
Well,
glad
she
she
was
was
not talking
aware.
about her own district. I mean, she was talking South Florida, South Texas, right?
Yeah, exactly,
Uh,
exactly. But it's like these, but it's true because like I talk to older generations of Asian Americans, right? And like they say something similar about being. They're like, wow, like I feel like what all this rhetoric I'm hearing from the far left, what they call the far left, progressives. They're like, it reminds me of communist China, you know. They're like, it reminds me of the Cultural Revolution when a lot of language was policed. They say that, and they're like, I don't like how this like cancel culture has become like this like policed language, just like it was in the Cultural Revolution in China. And they're very, very like at a gut level, I think they're just very, very like against that. So, I not denying their experiences, right? Many of them went through that themselves. They lived through it, and it's like now they're
yeah,
here and they're just like, I don't want more of that
yeah,
in
but
their mind and their perception.
so one of the concerns I have, so aside from the substantive argument, and I'm in full agreement with you that we have an issue here with regard to cancel culture. Um, I mean, is there influence of social media? I mean, isn't it the case? I mean, you mentioned like the Twitter debate that you had with maybe some stranger you never know in real life, but then you get into these arguments, and the idea is simply that it's like a human communicative logic, right? Where it's like if I sit in front of you, I have to look you in the eyes. I mean, it's very unlikely that I will, mistreat you or, use foul language because, like,
Right.
because I get the feedback immediately. It's like, oh my God,
Right.
the hurtful, and, I shouldn't do that. Right.
Sure. Sure. Yeah.
While it seems to be that, if you're communicating in 140 characters, I think,
Yeah.
and you only see the text on the screen, I think it's much easier
Right.
to be to deliver negative energy.
Sure. 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 Yeah. There's like that, just that physical separation and distance, right? Through social media. There's like zero like relationship, right? Because it's like a stranger to a stranger. And there's, very little sense of context outside of what you say on your Twitter bio, right? Just still a very, very like shallow representation of like who we are as individuals or
Yeah,
human
yeah.
beings, right? And then, yeah, I mean, like yeah. Oh, okay. My earphones are starting to run out of battery. Oops. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that distance on social media, that physical and not just the physical distance, but even the relational distance, right? That it's like the networks, right, are so far removed. It's just that much easier, right, for strangers to be rude to each other and callous, right, like on social media.
Yeah, and so I think the main issue that we would have to address is, I guess, how would you reduce dependence on screen and social media? I mean, so I'm reading a book by Sherry Turkle, and she's teaches at MIT, and she's been studying a lot of like human robot interactions,
Mhm.
and now it's
This
basically
conversational firm.
uh, it's like Alone Together, I think is the title.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Oh, it's a different one.
But yeah, so was so you can look at human robot, but now it's like human phone, right? And and then the problem is that a lot of young kids find it very stressful to have real life conversations with people. They think it's much better to text people, right?
Is that what studies are showing? Are people uncomfortable with real life conversations now, more so?
Yeah, well, that's what the trend that Turkle is describing, and I think there's some
Oh,
evidence that we find today,
that's so
because
interesting.
like if you Google like Jonathan Haidt, and look at girls' hospitalization rates for self-inflicted harm,
Mm-hmm.
he finds that there has been an increase over the last decade or so,
Oh, wow.
and it's directly related to like the use of social media. I mean, like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Instagram,
I don't know.
videos comparisons and things like that.
I've definitely read similar articles on like the impact, the negative impact of social media on mental and emotional health. And I think that's a very real thing.
Yeah.
Like I even see it from some academics like on Twitter who like, have posted and said like, I need to get off social media for my own mental and emotional health at times, just like distance myself from social media. So, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean the thing that keeps us in relatively good health. I mean, it seems. I mean, I don't know. I always like to say that we are hunters. I mean, our bodies are definitely hunters, and I know that because I spent so much time in the same position that I'm with you, right? I'm sitting down in a chair and I'm looking at the screen, right?
Mhm.
And I I don't know. I sit for too long. I have a little bit of a headache. I get tired. I get a little cranky. It's like,
Yeah.
and then it's like I go take a walk or I go jogging, and then it gets a little bit better. I mean, it's like I'm not going to be completely well off, you could say, because I go back to the screen basically, right? So I like I go back to the soma, as what's that, Aldous Huxley, right? Go back to the addiction again, and yeah, I mean, in any way, I mean, if we can find ways to pull ourselves out of that, I mean,
So are you saying then like having interactions like outside of just even outside of like, being in front of your computer screen, outside of jogging, it's like, interactions, like social interactions, like physical in-person social interactions, like conversations with friends, colleagues, right? Like
yeah,
family, like
absolutely. Well, like we see that with COVID. I mean, it was so horrendous. I mean, so I have to say, like, I mean, my personality, I mean, I'm more of an introvert, so like I'm okay with like being by myself, and I also have self conversations, and then
but even introverts need social interaction too. Like a lot of my
yeah,
introvert friends during the pandemic actually were like going nuts at certain points. Like,
you
I
can
mean,
go
yes,
nuts too.
some parts of them I think really, really enjoyed the pandemic and they're just like, oh, okay, I don't have to see people as often now. But I think other parts, it's like, yeah, it's like we all need social interaction.
You,
Like,
you, you do need it, yeah.
yeah,
I've
it's
noticed
like
that, yeah.
it's like the same as a physical like law. It's like I think we are social beings.
Exactly, that's right, yeah. So and it's, I mean, and the pandemic is at fault for that, right? So
And I think this is why some recent like experts have been writing about like, we need to think of other solutions beyond just say no, to people who actually like, who really, really desperately need social interaction, like, and like have not seen people for a long time and like, are seeing family members,
yeah.
friends, in this like holiday season. I think I haven't read up on those articles very much, so I don't really know like if there have been other solutions or other better suggestions people have given.
Yeah,
Um,
but also I think, we adults, I mean, I think we're going to be able to bounce back, if everything goes back to normal, the vaccines work out, right? But I'm very worried about, like, teenage kids maybe, or even younger kids,
mm,
like, because um when the schools shut down, right,
yeah,
people are doing like online learning,
yeah,
and they don't get that interaction. And it's very important. I mean, like, you taught the young kids before, so you can speak better to that, right? Which is that education and learning, I mean, it's not just about you know transferring facts into your head, right? It's about learning how to interact with teachers and with your fellow students.
classmates and making friends. Yeah, all
Exactly. It's quite horrible what's happening, don't you think?
yeah, it is. It is. And I think that's why certain schools like have I know certain private schools in Princeton, like they've still continued in classroom teaching, but like socially distanced, and obviously everyone's wearing masks indoors. But yeah, there's different views of that, right? Like some people would say, like, wow, like that's taking such a big risk, like you're still risking like teachers and staff and kids, right? And parents and whoever else. Um, yeah, on the other hand, on the flip side, right, it's like it's that tension, right, between like safety, personal like health safety, but also like now we can also argue like mental and emotional health is at odds with physical health, right? Like because of the pandemic at times. So it's really, really hard. I mean, I don't think yeah, I don't think there's like any perfect solution to a lot of this. I think people who have met in person or gathered, like generally try to gather outdoors, I know. And even when they're outdoors, some people like still say like try to wear a mask. Some others will say like if you're gonna gather indoors, like limit to like a very small group and like have people get tested a certain number of days, like before that.
Yeah, yeah.
Continue to quarantine before you have that, like, before you meet other people in a small gathering. So like there are like precautions I think people can take, to do their best, right? To prevent some of, to do prevention as much as possible, even when they're gathering indoors, like constantly wear a mask. So
Yeah, I mean, isn't the issue also, like, Western society and, like, in Asian societies, where so part of the reason why the Asians are doing so well with COVID now, well, they had SARS, right? So they
yeah,
have had some previous experience with respiratory
right. They have
diseases.
more of the infrastructures in place to respond
Um,
faster.
Yeah, but also the idea of collectivism, I think, is very important, right?
Right.
Where, so there's this like terminology, I think, in psychology, social psychology, like tight versus loose societies, right?
Mhm,
So I
mhm.
guess the idea is that like Western societies are loose, which means it's about individual freedom, right? Like don't require me to wear a mask. Well, actually, nowadays, I mean, more people are wearing masks, but it's still not everybody. And I have to admit, like, if I don't see anybody close by me, I mean, I do pull it down, right? So,
Yeah, yeah.
um,
I think I'm sure you're not the only one who does that. I think a lot of people do that. There's definitely I know the times I've walked outside. Yeah, if there's no one around, like no one anywhere near me, like yeah, I will like sometimes also pull down my mask. But definitely if there's like people walking along a trail, like I would definitely have my mask on like constantly.
yeah, and that's the thing, right? It's like, so I haven't been in Asia in quite a while, but I watch a lot of food vlogger videos on YouTube
Mhm.
because I'm a foodie, I guess. And so these are like contemporary videos, right? Where it's like everybody was walking around the city. It's like everybody wears a mask. I mean, just totally disciplined, like in Asia,
Yeah,
in Bangkok, and
yeah, yeah.
in China as well. So and
Just mentality. Yeah, my friend who's from Beijing and is in school in Canada right now, like she was like, "Wow, like so good to see that Americans are now wearing masks." When she saw, I think a couple photos of like a few friends of mine who like all had masks on. Like, and she was just like, wow, like she was just as like, she grew up in China and Beijing. She was just like, I'm not used to seeing,
yeah.
in her mind, her perception is like Americans like aren't willing to wear masks like ever, but I think now she's like, oh, good job,
Yeah,
Americans. You're wearing masks now.
no, I think it's also good that the amount of information. I think so. I was shitting on social media just 10 minutes ago, and now I'm gonna sing the praise of social media because okay, well, there's
Oh, the fun
disinformation,
thing, right?
of course, for sure, but the good parts about a networked world, right,
Mhm.
is that when shit goes wrong somewhere else, I find out about it
Fast.
immediately, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So like we kind of knew. I mean, the first cases of COVID, I think the first reporting ever about it was maybe the first 2 weeks of January, I believe.
Mhm.
So there
Yeah.
were like reports, like people in WeChat groups, because the Communist Party was clamping down on information, right? The first 3 weeks of January, right?
Yeah. Right. Right. It's also for
Um,
image.
but through the WeChat groups, they shared with the journalists, and then the journalists shared with the Western, and so we kind of knew that COVID was out there, right? And I think by the end of January, when the first cases were being imported in like Iran, in Italy, and all these countries, and it was at that moment I realized that okay, I think we're all screwed, right? Um, yeah, and then we had the lockdown like a month and a half
So
later, right?
you had that sense already at that point. You're like, oh,
I
we're
I I I had a sense that this is going to be global pandemic and this is going to get much worse.
oh, when was that?
Um,
When you heard
well, well, so the thing is, so as long as the cases were in China, right, in Wuhan, right, then I was like, okay, all right, this is local transmission. We don't have to worry about that.
mm,
But then I know there was this one woman from Wuhan. She was a tourist. She traveled to Paris. Like she had a fever, and she still walked around with no mask, like in the restaurant and whatever. And I was like, wow, okay,
mhm,
this is gonna get really bad. And then the images that came from Wuhan, I mean, it was so shocking,
mm,
like you know, but yeah, now it's happening in other parts of the world. But we can all learn from that, right? And the vaccine development was pretty quick, I would say. I mean, it's very unusual to get a vaccine like 1 year after onset of research.
Mhm.
So I mean, I guess the lesson would be, I think that, if we humans are sort of faced with a challenge, I mean, now we can sort of deal with it much better. I mean, like the Black Plague, which was in the 14th century,
Yeah.
which killed so many people, and people didn't know clinically, scientifically, what the cause was, right?
Right.
And so it could just spread freely, and
Mm.
now we know much better, right? So it's good. But then I'm a little bit worried, because so even if we control COVID, like, we're not going to be able to control climate change, which I think is a much bigger problem, right?
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
gets warmer and warmer every year, and
I think for our generation, that's really like one of the foremost things we need to tackle. Yeah.
right. I mean, so do you have an opinion about, like, activism around that, like, Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future, and like high school activism?
So activism. Oh, like Gen Z activism. I
Very
think I
much.
read some BuzzFeed article recently that was like Gen Z like shitting on millennials. And then there was another one
Oh,
that was like another BuzzFeed articles of like things that like Gen Z like how Gen Z says shit about millennials and then how millennials like what shit millennials say about Gen Z. And it was just really interesting because like one of them was like one of the ones about millennials saying this about Gen Z was like, oh, they act like they're the generation that invented activism.
well, I mean, yeah, well, then you could say, activism goes back for, like,
Right.
centuries, right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Activism has always been around, right? Yeah, it's just like done a little bit differently, right? Like through different platforms, through different mediums, right? A little bit now through with social media. Yeah, no, I think it's great actually that I mean I'm happy to see this like activist spirit in millennials and in Gen Z. Like I think it's great. I think it's good that there is this like this vision for social good like in both these generations. I think I mean people always like every generation says shit about like the generation above or the generation below, but
yeah,
like
okay,
I
yeah,
actually think we need to acknowledge the good things too, right? That are
yeah, yeah,
happening. And I really do think one thing I'm seeing in like millennials and Gen Z is that like there's a real like consciousness, you know, for social good and like
yeah,
or like the wider like good of like society and like you know our communities for like people in other regions and other countries, you know. And like I think that mindset is great. Like I'm really actually proud of these generations for like having that. um and I hope that continues because that's I mean this is the leadership of tomorrow, right? So
yeah.
like we need to like I mean we're all gonna like literally burn, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, I like the Michael Moore analogy. I mean, he compared it to, sitting in a sinking boat, with a small cup in his hand, and then what he does is, he shovels the water out of the boat, and even as, like, 100 times as much water is gushing in as he's shoveling out, but it doesn't matter. At least he feels like he's doing something, right? And that's how I would look at the climate change problem. I mean, it's a very pessimistic framing, right? But because the magnitude of the changes required, I mean, it's so huge, right? There's a chapter written by Michael Mann. He's a historical sociologist at UCLA, and he's an old guy now, but he takes climate change very, very seriously. And he says that, you know, so there's like I guess the physics equivalent is like inertia, right? So inertia is sort of it's part of the political economy, essentially, right? Where, there's a certain way how we extract fossil fuels in order to, heat our homes, in order to transport ourselves. And, there's like a certain standard of living that we're used to. We know that burning fossil fuels is tied to job creation, right? Directly and indirectly, right? So it's like we kind of have to go to this like anti-economic mindset, really. It's like,
Right, right. And I mean that's one of the conservative critiques, right? Of like, when they talk when activists talk about like the negative side effects of like fracking, right? Like the conservative view is like, well, then you're getting rid of like all these jobs like in that industry, right? And that's I mean that is that like a legitimate critique? I mean, I think it's true, right? Like you would get rid of like jobs,
yeah.
right, in an industry if, but it's like, yeah, I mean, this is where I actually haven't read like a lot into this debate, so I wish I knew more. But like I would imagine like, progressives would probably say like, well, then in that case, like we have other policy solutions like to address, like if this industry suddenly is like, collapsing or we're getting rid of it, and like then we're gonna have another policy solution to like maybe like a
Like a
freedom
basic
dividend.
income. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right. That's
freedom
right. That's right.
dividend at that point, like for those people who have
That's
lost
right.
those jobs, right? um yeah, I mean, this is a tough part with policies, right? It's like there's always like a lot of different moving pieces and parts that we have to consider, right? It's really really hard to find like win-win solutions a lot of times, right? And this is why like, the whole political system is so fraught, right? Because yeah, it's like, there's always so many different interests at play, right? But I think one thing that is very clear, and this is what I've always really appreciated about Bernie Sanders and the progressive wing, is that I think they've really trumpeted this whole like economic inequality, but not just economic. Now it's also like racial inequality, right? Um, Gender inequality, like all these different inequalities, right? That sociologists have been writing about like for decades, right? Now, like sociologists, I actually think in the last 5 years, I don't know if you've noticed this, Larry, but I remember when I started the PhD program at Princeton back in 2014, I came across an article that said it was like a critique of, or some op-ed that was like, why aren't sociologists more prominent or more influential in public discourse, in policy debates, in policy discourse? And it was making the argument that sociologists should play more of a role in that. It was like at that point is mainly economists, right? But I think what we've been seeing in the last like 5 years, maybe even more than 5 years, is that I think with like the rise of progressivism and that whole wing, like I think sociologists have definitely been a greater part of that public discourse and that public conversation. That's something I've noticed. I don't know if you've observed this at all.
There's some trend like that happening. I mean, it's definitely about power relations because I mean, I understand like, so if you became an economist, right? You don't just have to work for academia, right? Like, I mean, if you're in sociology or anthropology or liberal arts, I think, I think your vision is a little bit more constrained because there's not enough like demand in the broader society.
Just like,
Um,
like exit options, right, for jobs.
right. So as an economist, I mean, you could work for a bank, bank economist. You could work for Federal Reserve,
Mhm.
federal government, right?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of positions there, and I think why? Because economics and GDP growth is at the essence of our society, right? That's like
Mhm.
the software that sort of propels the computer, right? And the computer, of course, is our society, right? And yeah, and then to have some alternative voices, whether it's like ecology, I think is very important, and sociology, like racial injustice and so forth. Uh, I think it plays a more important role. Yeah, I think I would agree with that argument for sure.
I mean, sociologists study economics too, right? I mean, like actually a lot of sociologists are studying like class inequalities, right? Economic inequalities. So that's, I mean, that's a big part of the conversation now, because I think traditionally I don't think economists have written as extensively, right, about class social inequalities as much as sociologists have. And in these last 5 to 10 years, like that's become a greater part of the public lexicon, the public discourse. A lot of these terms and phrases, I think, are very much rooted in social theorists, like in social theory and in sociology. So
Well,
I
I
think
mean, if you look at the history of economic thought, I mean, all these old guys like, Adam Smith, David Ricardo,
sure.
Karl Marx, Joseph Schumpeter. I mean, they came from a long tradition where they were not only were they not afraid to talk about class. I mean, in fact, class was a major, it was a major unit of analysis when they,
Mm-hmm.
when you look at like who gets the benefit. Is it the landlord? Is it the capitalist? Is it the worker? And
Sure.
they were very explicit about like the factions in society, right? And that and that's why like the study of like economics in the old days, we call it political economy, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
To
exactly.
make that link explicit, that like
Same.
economics is not just about like how you eat, and personal utility maximization,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
it's also about political power and who gets to wield it, right?
And I think that's why, like, when I studied, when I chose my majors in undergrad, like, I couldn't study politics. I couldn't study economics without studying politics. I'm just like, this doesn't make sense. Like, to me, like, yeah, to me, like, those things are also intertwined, exactly.
Right, but then the way how it's being taught in college, right? So you take a political science course, and
They're so
then
divorced from each other.
right, and then they talk about whatever the three branches of government and federalism,
Yeah.
and then when you take an economics class, you see two intersecting curves.
Right, right. And it's just
Uh,
like you don't see like how these things actually are in relation to each other and how they interact with each other and actually how there's like yeah. I actually yeah, I'm not a fan of how these things are taught these days.
right. So that's why, like, did you read Robert Heilbronner? I think his book was titled "The Worldly Philosophers," and I think like for people who are non-jargony, non-economists, non-historians, I think this is probably the best book you can find. Like really, like just basically talking about the big ideas. The big ideas,
Yeah.
the big thinkers. The biography, the times that they lived in, the arguments that they made, the debates that they had with each other. I mean, it's very well written. I mean,
Oh,
I,
that's
I,
great. Can you forward that title to me? I'd like to take a look.
yeah, worldly
Recommend it.
philosophers. Yeah, I'll send it to you afterwards.
Sorry, the philosophers what?
The worldly philosophers.
Worldly philosophers.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was. I had originally read it myself back in undergrad, um, and then later on I had a meeting with a guy named Ivar Burke, who was a sociologist, really an economic sociologist. He read a
Yeah.
lot of economic stuff,
Yeah.
uh, and um, and he said and he said that I should read this book, and I was like, yeah, I read this. It was
Oh,
great.
nice. You're like, oh, I
Uh,
already read it.
I already read it, but yeah, Ivar Berg, I was really fond of that guy. I mean, uh, but but yeah, like like just understanding the history. I think that's the best way of like if somebody were to ask me like, oh, politics, economics is so separate. Like, how do I see them as combined? And I would just tell them, well, just read history. Like. And I think the Heilbronner would probably be the best introduction to that one. Okay, so so there's just one more point, and then I'll let you go because I think we should bring this up,
Yeah.
which is that okay, let's assume that the theater will all stop, right? January 20, right? Trump is going to be kicked out of the White House, kicking and screaming, hopefully, right? This will be great comedy for us. But my so my concern are several. I mean, so first of all, it's about norms of democracy, right? That it has become okay to violate these norms, right? Because he wants to throw out electoral votes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But then also the other concern that I have is that what's going to happen in 4 years? What's going to happen in 8 years? It's like I'm so concerned that you know, that the root causes of the anger, right,
Mhm.
of the countryside, of the, you know, like, I mean, like, you know, we sociologists, we talk about this in very clinical terms almost, right? It's like
Rural America. Yeah.
rural America, less educated, right? I mean, the people that that Bob Woodnow interviewed for a
Yep.
study, right?
Yeah, this is a lot of Bob Withnow's research. Right.
Um, so it's like I'm extremely concerned that, like, we're not going to fix that in that short time order, and in fact, I mean, we know we might be suffering from you know, continued COVID harm, right? Both in terms of the physical health, but also the body politic, the economics of it.
Yeah.
And then, you know, is Trump going to run again, or maybe his children, or Tucker Carlson, or anybody that sort of could sort of rile up the masses, you know, against the city urban elites, the educated, whoever the enemy is going to be, you know, maybe immigrants again, right? You know, circle back the old enemies, right?
I don't know. Yeah, so this is a question about like let's play predict the future. What's gonna happen?
Yeah, I mean, or like some thoughts about, like, you know, well, what could be happening, and also what could we do about it, you know, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, sure. I think, and I think you and I touched on a little bit of this last time too in our lunch conversation, but and I think a lot of this was tied in part to the conversation about the future of the Democratic Party, right? If they actually wanted to continue to win elections. Um, yeah, I think I think my proposal was that I think Democrats need to follow Stacey Abrams' lead. I mean, I know a lot is made out of AOC, and I think she's awesome. Like, I really respect AOC. I have so much respect for her. And I actually like agree with a lot of what she says. There are also times that certain things that I don't agree, but I feel like a lot of what she says, I'm like, yeah, I'm with you on that. Like, yeah, why don't we want like better housing, better like, you know, we want jobs for people, like we want like, you know, welfare and like community and social services, all these good things, right? It's like, to me, it's like common sense, right? But yeah, I think Stacey Abrams to me is like someone who, again, like as I said earlier in this conversation, like I think she understand. I think a Democrat like her has a better chance of reaching your rural white centrist like conservative voter, you know, who voted for Trump rather than AOC. Um, so I think progressives in the like, you know, like AOC, like will have to work a little harder, I think, to be able to, you know, to engage voters who were Trump supporters. I don't think Democrats are going to win elections in the future if they don't learn how to better engage some of these more conservative voters, because actually a significant portion of the electorate that did flip to Biden this time, these are your moderate, more centrist voters. Some of them were, you know, like, right, like what was it, the McCain like Republicans, right, that ended up voting for Biden. Like that's not gonna,
Arizona, yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's not going to happen in a future election if the Republican candidate is not like a Trump figure, you know? Like let's not even talk about if it's Trump who runs again. If it's like, I mean, if it's like a Trump figure, then yes, maybe like that same pattern may occur again, possibly. But who knows? It's like, you know, some variation of Trump. There could still be like a, you know, maybe he's not the same exact as Trump, and he still appeals to like, you know, the working class white voters. Um, there still is, you know, for sure, like that kind of appeal, right? That could flip the vote. Um, so I don't think Democrats can bank on like the McCain Republicans who ended up voting for Biden this time, you know, or all these like other centrist moderate voters who voted for Trump in 2016, but then flipped in 2020 because they're like, I just can't take another 4 years of Trump, right? So like, I don't think Democrats should be like, you know, congratulating themselves right now and being thinking like, oh yeah, like everything's going to be fine like in 2024, even in 2022. You know, it's like I think Democrats like really need to learn how to like talk to voters who, and again, this is going back to our conversation about the politics of language, right? Like we need to learn how to talk to voters with very different like political backgrounds and leanings. And but then again, some progressive activists and some like political activists would argue like there's no point in engaging those voters, you know. I think they're saying like Trump
Yeah.
supporters, like you aren't going to change their mind at this point.
It's illogical in the U.S. political system, and the reason is
Yeah.
because every state has two senators, right? Which means that you have like Wyoming and Mississippi. I mean, these are like states that are deeply conservative, but they have the same amount of political weight as New York and California, which have huge populations, right? So he's even by the logic of like that Clinton used in a derogatory way, right? The basket of deplorables, right? I don't need these people, right? It's not true. I mean, the political calculus is that 25% of the U.S. population controls 50 Senate seats, right? Which are half the Senate seats, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So by definition, I mean, we have minority rule in the United States Senate.
Mhm.
And that's where, of course, the big policies have to happen because the state and local governments are hampered because they don't, well, they raise some taxes but not a whole lot, and
Right.
they cannot run deficits. So it's really federal politics which allocates a lot of the resources that get spent in this country.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Definitely.
yeah, so
Yeah. So
that would be the
maybe
challenge.
it doesn't make sense to some, political activists, right, to engage like the very conservative voter, the voter who's very like staunch like Trump supporter. Like you're not going to easily change their mind. Um, on the other hand, like yeah, like kind of what you were saying earlier, right? There's a decent swath of the country who is kind of in this middle, right? And they can vote either way. So if the next Republican that runs is not Trump, like depending on what happens, with and depending on how Democrats continue to perform and how they continue to frame a lot of issues, what they get done these next few years, I think we're going to see like um, who knows, there may be a flip, but not. I mean, if things improve, then Kamala Harris, right? Very likely who people are predicting she will run in like 2024. So
Yeah.
could
So
be.
so cultural identity issues, I think, are very important. And I think, we definitely need people to figure out, how to talk to rural voters. But I mean, for me, I mean, I bring it all back to economics and money issues. I mean, because I think, it's like it's very nice to talk about cultural framing and
Yeah, I totally agree
define the
with you.
police debate, but I
I
think,
totally agree with you. I think we really need. I think we're going to talk to rural white voters. Like we definitely need to focus too on like just the economic issues, right?
exactly, it's like they need money,
Yeah,
and then it's
a
like,
lot of
well,
their
how,
jobs have been taken away. Like they don't have the same kind of jobs they had 10, 20 years ago.
right, and then the money, basic income would be a big part of that. But then I don't know. I mean, I had a discussion with Alejandro Portes about it, and so he sort of holds the line of like, the job gives you dignity, right?
Hmm.
And then it's like, no, you shouldn't be doing, you shouldn't be increasing, handouts, right?
But
You should be increasing public job creation.
sure, right.
So,
And I think maybe that's what Bernie Sanders was pushing for too, right? In contrast, but I think my understanding of UBI and of the freedom dividend, as Andrew Yang framed it, is that it's meant to be a supplementary income. It's not meant to be the whole of your income. So that means that people are still going to have to like look for jobs, right? And still like be working. But
right.
having that supplementary income and the point, and like Andrew Yang even did this experiment during his presidential campaign, right? Where he like picked like a group of families and like gave them the freedom dividend, right? and like let them just like, and he kind of like ran his own study essentially, right? Like during that time to see like what they would do with the money, right? And how it would be used, and then interviewed them after, right? Um,
Well, so the metaphor here is very important, right? So, if we have, this big welfare state, which could include UBI or not, like, do we have, a hammock or do we have a floor, right? And I think, so the hammock, there was like Paul Ryan, he said, well, people are lying down if we give them welfare, right? And that was also the debate in the 1990s when we were really young back then, I guess. Under Bill Clinton, right? He said, we end welfare as we know it. We don't want, people to lie around on government support.
sure.
And then there was this book, the pro UBI book was written by Andy Stern, 2015. There was a book that motivated Yang's campaign.
Mm.
It was titled "Raise the Floor,"
Mm.
and the floor metaphor I think is beautiful, right? Because it says, it's like we don't allow you to fall below that floor, basically, right? And that's the minimum of, like, you could say, a basket of goods that people have to buy to survive.
Yeah. I mean, I think in theory, a lot of politicians would actually be on board with this. I think a lot of Americans, I mean, people anywhere, I think would in general be on board with this, right? Like we raised the ceiling so much for CEO pay. Why can't we raise the floor? Like to me, it's always ridiculous. Like how, I mean, and having like studied entrepreneurs, right, an investor, and like been like a little bit part of this world, right? It's just like, to me, it's like, and then like studying all these, I'm just like, it's ridiculous, like how much CEOs get paid, right? And it's like, we're paying CEOs that, like, why can't we not like raise the floor, right?
Yeah.
Like that's just illogical to me. I'm like, okay, so rich people are gonna like have a little less money, like, okay, that's fine. Like 10,000 to them is not the same as 10,000 to, like, a person on like the bottom like income bracket, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's it's a thing that, I mean, we sociologists noticed, of course, a long time ago, but this issue of, like, capitalism, there's two functions, right? So in any economic system, I mean, you're supposed to produce enough wealth, right? And it's true that communism didn't do a good job with that. And it's true that if you have private property and incentives, like that, you're gonna increase production. But then the second function is distribution, right? It's about ensuring that everything that gets produced, people can actually have entitlement to consume it. And unfortunately, I mean, the capitalist reality is that there's only emphasis on the production end, right? It's like, and then distribution is like determined ex post, like in the labor market, basically, right?
Right.
Whoever asks for your service.
And distribution is also controlled by those who hold the control over production, right? Oftentimes.
Exactly. And then it's like, and then they say, well, okay, for the very poorest, like who are disabled or people who haven't found work, yeah, okay, to those people we'll give the crumbs, like we're gonna make sure that they're not gonna starve, but we don't want to give more, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of scarcity mentality, I mean, it's like, unless we can get rid of that, I think the political environment is going to be very unstable. I mean, if somebody's, because Trump is like an idiot narcissist, I think, but if his successor is, you could say, competent and evil, right? So not just incompetent evil, but competent evil, right? I'm very concerned that, like, they'll take it, that person will take advantage, and then it's like, okay, we don't need democracy anymore, it's like, we don't need rule of law,
Yeah. No, that would be a nightmare. That'd be a total nightmare.
Yeah, but we'll figure it out over time, maybe. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
not be
I
able to solve
really,
it today.
I mean, I think if anything, like what encourages me about the last 5, 10 years that I've seen change in politics is that like people are talking about inequality now in politics. This never used to be a thing. In the Obama years, who talked about inequality? No one, but then after it was like suddenly there's like a lot of discourse over inequality, right? So I think the fact that this is already publicly, like this is in the public consciousness, right? That means that maybe there's also a possibility. I don't know if you went to that talk at Princeton. There was like there was some economists, I think, who were advising like Elizabeth Warren's campaign and like Bernie Sanders' campaign. And they like showed this graph like at that presentation about like just about like is it possible to like they're like will Bernie Sanders get his wish of like a billionaire free world like even with like these increased tax hikes, right, like on the top like 1%, right? And they basically showed like no, like there would still be some billionaires, like sorry Bernie Sanders, but like yes, it will still be some billionaires. But it's just like that increased tax hike actually could do a lot, right, to raise the floor, as you're saying, right? And that's why now AOC is like printing out these sweatshirts that say like tax the rich, right?
Uh,
So,
that would be the solution to a lot of things. I mean, I don't know whether it will be the final solution to everything, because I mean, I'm just a capitalism pessimist. I mean, it's just
yeah, no, no,
maybe
actually,
I'm too steeped in Marx and Strake and people like that.
I
Um,
will say this. I talked to, so because I've talked to like some venture capitalists, like I've interviewed quite a number of venture capitalists like in my work, right? And some of them are like actually very successful like venture capitalists. The ones who have a somewhat more humanistic view actually argue they actually are in favor of this too. They're like, yeah, like they're like the rich don't need to get any richer. And they're also in favor of UBI because they recognize the importance of social stability, and just the fact that there would not be social stability if there's like such an extreme inequality. So I think there are people in Silicon Valley. The reason why they're talking about UBI so much in Silicon Valley is because I think they are cognizant of this like this extreme inequality that is happening. So
yeah, so I think there was a study. I don't know whether it was a sociologist who published it, but it was about
um
in Wyoming.
yeah.
So it's a very rural state,
Hmm.
and people, and so the Silicon Valley titans and maybe even some Wall Street investors, they purchase, a plot of land, and then they build, well, it's like a giant house, and then also like a big basement, which is kind of like a bunker, right?
Hmm.
And then they, equip all kinds of facilities with it. And I guess the expectation is that, if the whole society goes to shit, like they'll have a place where they can retreat
And be
and
safe from the pitch.
yeah, they'll have like, whatever, armed guards outside and whatever.
That's
um
crazy.
uh, I'm sure there was a sociologist who studied that. I remember there was a New York
You
Review of
sent
Book
me that
article
source.
about that.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
I want to take a look at that. Actually, I was going to ask you a little bit about the Y. Have you seen the Y Combinator study? Have you followed the Y? I haven't followed the Y Combinator study more
Yeah,
recently.
I know about Y Combinator because I went to a University of Michigan workshop. It was 2 years ago. That was the origin of my basic income book, by the way.
Okay.
But
Okay.
yeah,
They're
yeah,
doing
we
that
met
basic.
a bunch of these people.
They're
Yeah,
doing that basic income like study. So that tells you. I mean, I read blogs from like from leading like venture capitalists who are writing about like why we need to implement like universal basic income. So I don't know if you've read those blog posts like from some of these venture capitalists. I can search it up and like send it to you if you're interested.
yeah, they are definitely very much into UBI. I mean, you can see. I mean, like, Mark Zuckerberg, who's getting the shit now because of antitrust lawsuits. But 3 years ago, he gave the Harvard graduation speech, and he said, we need to give UBI because, I want to give people the same opportunities that I had when I who was sitting in the Harvard dormitory and founded Facebook, right?
Mhm.
So he gave this like, so he framed UBI in a very entrepreneurial
Yeah, he did.
kind of way. Um,
What he
and
didn't say is that there will be pitchforks coming for him and other people
yeah,
until
I think he understands it. I think he understands this. I mean, even, I mean, like he dropped out. I guess he didn't get the degree, right? But I think there's some awareness on his end for it. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, but then also like there's people like Bezos and Musk, the very rich people right now, and so Blue Origin, I think, is the project by Bezos, and Musk has like uh, Tesla, and it's about like space exploration, right? That they're
right,
funding,
right.
and
Yeah, I know. It's so like
yeah, they frame it as like a grandiose vision for humanity, right? For everybody, right? But
it's not. It's just for their own ego trip. Let's be
yeah,
real.
but also it's like, I mean, could you also frame it as a way of escaping the pitchfork, right? It's like, I don't
Oh,
want to deal with the problems up
to a
here.
different universe, a different like planet, literally.
Yeah, right. And
Only the rich can afford it.
only the rich could afford it. I mean, that could be an issue. This it's not the way how Bezos sells it. I mean, so Bezos basically, he admits that climate change is an existential threat, right?
So he's like, I'm gonna get the F out of here before that affects me.
Exactly. That's right. That's right. So he's basically like, but when I read his interview about it, like when he presented his space exploration project, and he said, I want to have a trillion human beings, and I want to have thousands of geniuses, like Mozart and Einstein was the names that he used. Um, if it were true, I think it does sound very attractive, right? So basically, so Bezos is so obsessed with the growth logic, right? It's like everything has to grow, right? We have to
Yeah.
produce more and more.
Hmm.
And then he says, well, we know that the planet cannot give us that, right? Because we already explored the whole planet, right? I mean,
Right.
there's no more Christopher Columbus mission to
Right.
discover a new continent, right? So it's like, okay, then what's the next best thing we can do? Just go out to the space. Um,
Hmm.
and again, I mean, the cynical take is, yeah, he's escaping the pitchforks. And then the, maybe more friendly take would be that, you know, he's advancing humanity,
Yeah. Well, um, yeah, there's different interpretations. I will say like quality of life in outer space for a while is not going to be great, even if he achieves like getting to outer space. But even just putting down the initial infrastructure, right, for to be like livable, right, for outer space to be livable, like that's going to take some time to develop too, right? So I wonder if like, I mean, yeah, unless the pitchforks are like reaching their home, and then comparatively, right, like outer space is a more attractive option.
Well, I mean, but if it reaches that point, right, it's going to be like, then I don't think that they, can actually do this space exploration. I think because these things, I mean, they require a lot of time and investment,
Yeah, of
and then investment requires security, political stability, right?
course.
Like,
Yeah.
I mean, there's a reason, why. I mean, that's why I don't like the libertarian argument about like the way you don't need government, right? And then, but then the people who say that, I mean, they're never going to move to Afghanistan and Somalia, right? Because
Right.
those
Yeah,
countries
yeah,
have
I
shitty
like that. I
governments.
like that. Say it to
I
the
mean,
libertarian, like, oh, you want to live without a government? Okay, yeah, go to these places.
yeah, I mean, and you can see the HDI is very low, Human Development Index.
Right.
You can, I mean, you don't have like Bezos or Buffett or people like that living there, right?
Mhm.
Um, so we need to find a modus vivendi, and I think society will somehow find these things.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I think so too. That might be a good place to end.
but just the very last reference that I bring up here
Because
is
I'm running low on my laptop battery. That's why.
yes. So Steven Pinker, he basically says that he's actually very optimist about humanity because of longevity increasing and diseases getting defeated. I mean, despite COVID, I guess he wrote it before COVID, but you know, so maybe there's a silver lining to everything. Okay, I think I should let you go now, but thank you very much, Grace, for
This is
being so
super,
generous with your
super
time.
interesting. Yeah, this is really,
Yeah,
really
yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Larry. I'm really glad we had this, like, had the opportunity to have this conversation. It's actually like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's just a lot of fun on both ends of mine.